Chapter 110. Through the misty morning mist, Timothy Wimbledon could vaguely see the flags fluttering on top of the city wall. He raised his telescope and tried to identify the family emblem on the flag. The sailboat and crown pattern on the green background undoubtedly belonged to his sister, Garcia Wimbledon. This was also the most flags on top of the city wall. The second most was the white flag, with a white base with a tower and a snake wrapped around the tower. That was the emblem of the Balia family. "Oh," he sneered in his heart, "you've taken refuge with the Queen of Clearwater, but you still hang a flag with a tower pattern. You're simply shameless. Wait until I catch you, traitor, I'll feed you the flag, Earl Balia," he thought in his heart. Finally, there was the red tower, lion, an equally shameless Sita family. Timothy was expressionless, but in his heart, he had already sentenced Aaron Sita to death, just like Toman Balia. Of course, he also had to eat the flag. "Sir Naaman, raise the flag of the Greycastle Kingdom," Timothy ordered. "Yes, Your Majesty." The cold wind knight responded, and then urged his horse to run to the army behind him. "The king has ordered, raise the flag." The new king looked back and saw the flagpoles being raised, the grey flag unfurled in the wind, the black pattern appeared solemn, the huge tower and the two sides of the inverted, crossed spears. This was the emblem of the king of Greycastle. Any traitor would be beheaded under this flag. After receiving the news of Garcia's independence, he immediately took measures, mobilizing the troops of the eastern region and King's City to attack Eagle City. Although at that time, his heart was like a huge wave, he still maintained a calm appearance, which boosted the confidence of his ministers. It took nearly a month to gather the vassals and troops, a week to go to the eastern region, and another half a month to get here. Timothy finally arrived at Eagle City yesterday at sunset. Fortunately, King's City was not affected by the months of demons, so the road to the southern region was not impassable because of the snow, but the ground was very solid because of the low temperature, so the carriage team transporting grain was faster than the freedman. His team was very large, mainly consisting of his personal guards, the Royal City Knight Regiment, and the troops of the Duke of the Eastern Region, Francherite. There were more than 6,000 people in the three groups. Among them, there were more than 1,000 well-trained and well-equipped knight. According to reliable intelligence, Garcia's troops numbered less than 3,000 people, and most of them were free citizens of the port of Clearwater. Usually, they could plunder unarmed farmers and merchants, but in a head-on battle, it was impossible for them to be a match for the knight. The Minister of Finance, Sir God, had raised an objection. He believed that after the end of the months of the demons, all the places would need to be farmed, and the conscription of the army at this time would have a detrimental impact on the harvest. Therefore, Timothy did not ask his vassals to dispatch serfs to fight in the war. Instead, he gathered the freedmen in his territory and had them take charge of logistics and transportation. In this way, even if they fought in the south, they would not miss the spring plowing. No matter what, Timothy Wimbledon would never allow Garcia to stay in the Southern Territory any longer. Eagle City was not a strong city. It used to be a market, located in the middle of the surrounding towns. Later, with the development of commerce, it gradually evolved into a city, which lasted for less than 100 years. In addition, in order to promote its pro-business image, the previous lords did not build an insurmountable wall. The 3,000 civilian troops and the 2 earls' men added up together were not enough to form a large army, so the earlier they could take countermeasures, the greater their chances of winning. If they gave her a chance to breathe, and let her completely integrate the entire Southern Territory, it would be very difficult for them to defeat her. After a night of rest, his men had eaten and drunk to their heart's content and were ready to move out. The sun gradually turned from orange-red to a dazzling gold. The fog began to dissipate, and the brown city wall was revealed. In the eyes of the new king, it was not a real city wall at all. At best, it was just a dirt slope. From the bottom of the slope to the top of the slope, there was no need to use any siege ladders, they could directly climb up with their hands and feet. At the top of the slope, there was a circular wooden fence that was as high as a person's height. It could block refugees and robbers, but it could not block heavily armed soldiers. The people standing at the top of the city wall were sparse. It was obvious that they were not ready to defend the city. Your Majesty, the cavalry responsible for watching the south gate reported that they have observed the movement of a large group of people. The cold wind knight ran back to the side of the new king, reined in his horse and reported. Timothy handed the telescope to Duke Fran, and said in a relaxed tone, "It looks like she wants to escape." The latter carefully watched for a moment, nodded. She can make up her mind so quickly, it can be regarded as a decisive choice. Eagle City is not suitable to defend. If she leaves her troops in the city, we will only be able to catch them in one fell swoop. The Duke said this with a smile. As you expected in the war meeting last night, she did not expect us to come so soon. We arrived at the right time, Timothy said. Even if she wanted to escape, she would not be able to move at night. You are right, marching at night is a big taboo. If she really did that, we would not need to take the initiative to attack. Her troops would collapse without a fight. And once the troops are separated at night, there is almost no possibility of them ever gathering again. In this way, even if she managed to escape back to the port of Clearwater, there would only be a dead end. Therefore, my dear sister must wait until daybreak to command the army to retreat. Timothy looked at Eagle City with satisfaction, thinking that everything she had done was not beyond her expectations. Garcia was too greedy for the symbolic status of Eagle City, so she stationed her troops here. Occupying the mansion of the Southern Guardian was indeed easier to conquer the hearts of the Southern nobles, but the benefits were also accompanied by danger. He deliberately sent a fake army to slowly travel, while he himself led the cavalry to the eastern region, without infantry, and used carriages to transport all the rations. After arriving in the eastern region, the Duke would supplement the rest of the troops, and from the other side of the kingdom, they would take a detour to Eagle City. The cavalry would first block the road, reducing the possibility of spies passing on information. It was impossible for the army to leave at once. Garcia should have received the ambiguous news 2 or 3 days ago, and today at dawn they began to retreat, which could be regarded as a hasty move. Retreating from Eagle City to Clear Spring Town would take a day on foot, and no matter what, 2 legs would not be able to outrun 4 legs. As long as he gathered 1,000 knights to catch up with her troops, chasing them down and killing them, her laughable coalition army would naturally collapse. Unfortunately, Garcia still had the possibility of escaping from his hands. If she left her 3,000 troops, and left by herself, it would not be difficult for her to return to the port of Clearwater alive. After all, I have to go to her lair, in order to finally end this farce, he thought. Your Majesty, according to the previous plan, let's act separately. Said Duke Fran, do you want me to attack the city, and then go through the city through the south gate, or do you want to take a detour? If we take a detour, we will have to walk a long way. It would be better for me to go around from the southwest, Timothy thought. The knights' movements are inconvenient in the narrow streets, and Garcia may also block the streets with debris, hindering the passage of the troops. Even if we take a detour, it will not hinder the follow-up pursuit. Then I'll set off, Your Majesty. Be careful, Timothy warned. Garcia will not leave any troops in the city, so I'm sure there will be a lot of traps. In addition, beware of narrow streets and places with a lot of houses. As long as she ambushes a group of soldiers, they will be able to threaten your safety. Ha ha ha, Duke Fran laughed heartily. Please rest assured, Your Majesty, when I followed your father into battle, I have personally beheaded hundreds of people, but I have never been injured. He waved his hand to the guards around him. Sound the horn, attack. The army behind him surged, and several streams of people came out of the formation. Under the leadership of several knights, they marched towards Eagle City. They were the vanguard troops of the freedmen, and behind them were the armored mercenaries, who were also the main force of the siege. The knight brought by the Duke had all been gathered under his command. Chapter 111. The first batch of cannon fodder did not encounter any resistance and successfully climbed up the slope. The slope formed an angle, slanting to the sky, blocking their footsteps. The fence was not tightly blocked, but left a gap for a spear to pass through. When the attackers destroyed the logs, the defenders only needed to stand behind the fence and use their spears to kill their opponents. However, to Duke Fran's surprise, the people who were originally standing on the wall had disappeared. The entire periphery was currently in a state of undefended. The vanguard troops quickly cut open several gaps with their axes, and after putting down a few logs, they rushed to the top of the wall. After a while, the wooden gate was also put down. "Let's go," the Duke shook the reins and led the rest of the troops towards the gate. From the beginning of the siege until the gate was put down, less than half an hour had passed. "What the hell is Garcia Wimbledon doing?" Fran frowned. Anyone with a little combat experience knew that when abandoning the city, it was necessary to leave behind a group of personal guards, or hire a lot of people who were not afraid of death to go to the top of the wall to block the enemy's offensive, as much as possible to buy time for the retreating troops. Princess Garcia was not a stupid person, otherwise it would be impossible for the entire southern territory to change sides with her so quickly. Why didn't she arrange a group of people to defend the wall? No matter how strong the defense, no matter how nimble the trap, without someone to operate it, it would only become a dead thing. Duke Fren thought for a moment and decided to let his personal guards enter the city first to explore the situation. The report from the guard captain was still the same. There was no resistance inside the city, but some streets were indeed blocked by wood and bricks. His subordinates had already gathered the local people to clear the obstacles. Fran no longer hesitated. He led the rest of the troops into Eagle City. He was also a veteran who had followed Wimbledon 3 for many years, so he could not be fooled by a little girl. But Timothy's move was a bit wrong. If he could wait until he attacked the gate, then directly pass through the city, he could save a lot of time. When passing through the gate, the Duke smelled a pungent smell. It was not the usual smell of rotting corpses on the battlefield, but a mixture of pine nut oil, orange peel and incense. If he took a deep breath, he could even feel some fragrance. What is this smell? He looked around but didn't find anything out of the ordinary. On the other hand, the ditch used to drain the earth wall was blocked. The dirty water flowed out of the ditch and slowly flowed along the ground. It was unknown how long it had been since anyone had taken care of those filthy things. They were black, and under the sunlight, they reflected colorful patterns of light. It was probably the smell of the dirty water. Fren shook his head and led the team to the castle area. Since he had conquered Eagle City, he naturally had to go to the Lord's Castle and City Hall to see if there was anything he could take away. Of course, this city was likely to have been plundered by Garcia. The golden dragon might not have been left behind, but some of the larger handicrafts and decorations were very suitable as spoils of war. It would be best to clean up the carriages that he had brought with him and use them to carry the spoils. As for the mercenaries, they were probably heading towards the shops and farms. Duke Joey was dead anyway, and it was still a question of who would be the next successor. At this time, robbing the entire city was the most important thing. After touring the Lord's castle, Fren Charrot noticed something was wrong. The castle was empty, he thought. Not only the coins, but also the whole basement. Not even a bit of cloth or food was left. Several places where murals were hung were left with blank walls, no books in the bookcases, and even the big bed in the Lord's bedroom was gone. The whole castle seemed to have been stripped bare. Was this something that could be done in a hasty retreat? Fran faintly felt that something was wrong. If they hadn't moved these things slowly from the beginning, the castle wouldn't have been so thoroughly looted. Just as he was about to go to the city hall to have a look, a thick cloud of black smoke suddenly rose from the north gate. What's going on? Is there a fire? I don't know, my lord. I've already sent Moriel to check, the guard captain said. Maybe the enemy deliberately set the fire. That's right, the Duke's first thought was that it was a trap, but he soon realized that this method of sealing the door with fire was meaningless. First of all, they could bypass the gate and climb out directly from the slope. Even if they just lit a fire, if no one took advantage of the chaos to attack, an organized team could quickly extinguish the source of the fire. The correct way to use it should be to set up troops inside the city, and when the fire broke out, they could take advantage of the enemy's panic to launch a surprise attack. This could effectively disrupt the enemy's formation, or even force them to retreat. As he said, a trap without anyone operating it was nothing more than a dead object. At this moment, the other 3 gates also emitted black smoke, but the north gate was already on fire, and the fire was rapidly expanding, as if it was piled with straw. The screams of civilians came from the city. It seemed that someone's house had been set on fire. This is not right, the Duke thought. I came from the north gate, where there was no fire starter, only an open space. But if there was no fire starter, how could the fire spread so fast? Wait, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Could it be that Garcia Wimbledon secretly recruited witches? Fran touched the god's stone of retaliation hanging around his neck, and his heart calmed down a little. If it was the witch's fire, he only needed to directly pass through it, and the devil's fire wouldn't be able to hurt him. Moreover, every member of the guard team was wearing this thing, so they wouldn't pose much of a threat. As for the freedmen who didn't have money to donate to the church, the Duke didn't have time to care about them. This city was a bit strange, so he decided to go out first. The army could camp at the south gate, where they could monitor Eagle City, and also receive the new king's cavalry. Thinking of this, he ordered the guard captain, "We'll go out of the city from the south, you blow the horn on the way, gather the troops." Yes. Everyone immediately set out, but when they arrived near the south gate, they found that the fire had already reached the city, and the houses had been set on fire. The heat wave forced them to retreat. The people who had been hiding in their houses, at this moment, also ran out. The streets were full of people, and even the guards' swords couldn't stop them from fleeing in panic to the open space that hadn't been burned yet. For a moment, everyone seemed to have fallen into a sea of fire, surrounded by smoke and flames. "Calm down. You go find a well, and use it to put out the fire." Duke Fran quickly issued a series of orders. "Don't bother with the houses, just put out the burning obstacles on the street, and clear the way. Don't stop the horn, let the others know our position." "Your Excellency the Duke." A knight came running from the direction of the city center, and before he could stop his horse, he jumped down from the back of the horse. It was Moriel, who had been sent by the guard captain to the north gate. "Your Excellency, the fire at the north gate can't be extinguished." "What did you say?" Fran asked in surprise. "Can't be extinguished?" "The fire is burning on the black water," she said quickly. "Not only will it not be extinguished by the water, but it will also flow along with the water." "Your Excellency, now the entire North City is burning. Unextinguishable fire." He murmured, "Yes, it seems to be the devil's fire." Then the Duke shouted, "Everyone, don't panic, this is Garcia using the evil witch to release the demonic fire. As long as you are wearing the god's stone of retaliation, even though this fire looks terrible, it will not be able to burn you. So that's how it is, may you be merciful." Moriel subconsciously touched her chest. "Your Excellency, what should we do? We have the god's stone of retaliation, what are we afraid of? Everyone, get on your horses, we will rush over." The Duke waved his hand. "As long as the devil's fire meets the god's stone, it will naturally disappear without a trace." He paused. "Moriel, you take a group of people out first, I will stay here to gather the people who are following us." "Yes." The female knight nodded. "Your Excellency, take care. The others, pay attention to keep up." Chapter 112. The King's City Knight Regiment was like a sharp silver blade, cutting into the rear of Garcia's team. The crowd suddenly became a mess, many people fell to the ground in panic, and then were trampled to death by the horses. Occasionally, some people pulled out their weapons to resist, but they were pierced by the skillful knight with their spears. Leading this unstoppable torrent, rushing at the forefront of the sharp blade was the chilly wind knight Naaman Moore. The blue-striped cloak fluttering behind him was particularly eye-catching. Wherever he went, the enemies would avoid him. After a round of killing, the tip of his spear and his sword were stained with blood. Timothy Wimbledon stood on a hillside in the distance, observing the situation of the battlefield. At this time, the tail of the team of 3,000 people was no longer as neat as before, the crowd was getting more and more scattered, and the team's speed almost stopped. They can't hold on for long, Timothy thought. 2 more rounds and his sister's team will collapse. These people have no way to resist the attack of the elite Knight of Greycastle, most of them don't even have armor. As long as they are hit by a sword, they will completely lose the ability to fight. Almost as he expected, it took an hour to detour around Eagle City, climb over a hill, and then pass through a sparse forest. The Knight regiment once again returned to the main road. Then he ordered the whole regiment to speed up, and finally caught up with Garcia's team at noon. Timothy divided the Knight regiment into 3 groups according to what the Duke had taught him. Each group had about 300 people, and they would take turns to attack the enemy's flank and rear. In this way, they could conserve their horses, and in case of an emergency, they could also mobilize reinforcements. In order to avoid being surrounded, the Knight regiment didn't need to rush into the crowd, they only needed to approach the enemy from the side, accelerate and rush, and then cut off a small part of the enemy's tail, causing dozens of enemy casualties every time. This tactic was obviously effective. After a few rounds, the enemy was killed or injured more than 100 people, but they had no power to fight back. They also wanted to organize a cavalry to fight back, but the equipment and training gap was too big. Compared to the King's City Knight Regiment, the temporarily put together cavalry was just a group of infantry riding on horses. In a moment, those cavalry who braced themselves to fight were killed and fled. This kind of one-sided massacre was a huge blow to morale. Timothy noticed that some of Garcia's troops had begun to break away from the formation and flee in other directions. It was time to launch an all-out attack, he thought. When the Cold Wind Knight returned with his team, he did not order the next round of attack. Instead, he returned to the Knight regiment from the hillside. "Your Majesty, they are about to be separated." Naaman wiped the sweat from his forehead. The blood in his palms had left a few marks on his face. It was the blood of the enemies. He had been fighting for so long and was still unscathed. Timothy took out his own handkerchief and handed it to him. "Well done. After a short rest, we will give the enemy the final blow." Seeing that the next round of Broken Tail charge had yet to arrive, Garcia's men realized that the decisive battle was about to begin. The huge team completely stopped moving forward and slowly gathered until they were all huddled together. The people at the outermost layer raised their wooden spears. Timothy snorted disdainfully. This was nothing more than a deathbed struggle. Without a barricade or armor, trying to stop the charge of the kingdom's Knight Company with just their bodies of flesh and blood would only result in a crushing defeat. Regardless of whether his third sister was still in the team or not, it would not change the outcome. Perhaps she had already changed her clothes and left, leaving this group of people to stall for time. But he soon found that he was wrong. The Queen of Clearwater's flag was once again raised in the crowd. The green flag fluttered in the wind. The sailboat and the crown pattern made Timothy frown. He raised his telescope and looked at the enemy's formation. He saw a vague figure of a woman standing on the platform, set up by several warriors. She raised her hand and seemed to be shouting something. He could not see her face clearly, but the fluttering gray hair revealed her identity. Garcia Wimbledon. Unexpectedly, she did not run. Timothy took a deep breath. Very good, in this way, the farce will end here early. He would not have to go to the port of Clearwater again. When the horses were fully rested, the new king issued the order for the whole army to attack. The knight and his retinue, composed of more than 800 cavalry, under the leadership of the king's Knight regiment, launched a charge against the enemy. The tip of the sword of the Knight regiment was still the Cold Wind Knight, Naaman Moore. Just as the Knight regiment was about to enter the enemy's formation, a large number of people suddenly appeared on the horizon on both the east and west sides. They issued a burst of strange cries and rushed all the way to the center of the battlefield. Timothy could not believe it and stared with wide eyes. Who were these people? There was no flag, no family emblem. The sudden appearance of this army was different from any of the forces in the kingdom. Through the telescope, most of them did not even have armor, and their weapons were also varied. However, in Timothy's knowledge, there was only one kind of people who had a tall and strong figure and a strange face. The Sand Nation of the southernmost region. He no longer needed to guess whether the other side was an enemy or a friend. There was no doubt that Garcia and the Sand Nation had reached some kind of deal, allowing this group of damned foreigners to intervene in the Grey Castle royal power. Thinking of this, Timothy was burning with anger. He turned around and shouted, "Sound the horn, call back the night regiment." But it was already too late. The high-speed charging army simply could not easily turn around. The night regiment plunged into Garcia's formation, and like a hot knife cutting through butter, they directly pierced the position of the Queen of Clearwater. Timothy eagerly looked at the flag that was fluttering in the wind, hoping that it would break. The Sand Nation attacking from both sides were about 1,000 people, so Garcia's army would swell to 5,000 people, which was a number that he couldn't handle. Moreover, the Sand Nation's people were very strong. Falling into close combat would be a great threat to the Night Regiment. If at this time he could kill the enemy's leader, cut off the flagpole, and destroy Garcia's militia regiment, he still had a chance to win. However, the flagpole swayed a bit, but still stood tall in the middle of the formation. The Sand Nation completed the encirclement, and followed the Night Regiment to join the battle. If not for this batch of reinforcements, Garcia's 3,000 outlaws should have already been defeated, but at this moment, they were still persisting, like a swamp, slowly dragging the Night Regiment into it. The horn of retreat resounded through the battlefield. One after another, the Night Regiment rushed out and approached Timothy, but there were still many people trapped in the enemy's formation, including the Cold Wind Knight. He was entangled by a 9 feet tall foreign warrior, and was already gasping for breath. The other side waved a giant wooden stick, creating a small empty space around the two of them. Naaman's mount had already been smashed to death. He relied on his extraordinary reaction and agility to dodge left and right, but the thick armor quickly consumed his remaining strength. Finally, when he dodged sideways, he lost his footing, and was hit in the chest by a sweeping wooden stick. The strength was so great that the armor sank into his body, and the wooden stick broke into two. The blue cloak slowly fell, and disappeared into the crowd. Chapter 113. Since the end of the months of the demons, it had only rained twice in the western region. The rest of the time, it had been sunny, as if it was making up for the winter. The previous musty smell in the office had been swept away, and the air became fresh and natural. When he opened the window, he could smell a light fragrance from the garden from time to time. By now, the land route between Border Town and Longsong Stronghold had basically been restored, and Roland had become particularly concerned about the movements of Longsong Stronghold. According to the situation of the previous year, after the land route was restored, there would soon be merchants going to Border Town to sell their daily goods, but so far he had not seen a single merchant from Longsong Stronghold. In the past week, the First Army had entered the comprehensive training stage, including the defense line and field pursuit. The former mainly relied on lightning to report the distance of the enemy in the air, and the artillery and flintlock teams fired according to the instructions. This part was relatively easy, both the instructions and the corresponding actions were clear. The former mainly relied on lightning to report the distance of the enemy in the air, and the artillery and flintlock teams fired according to the instructions. This part was relatively easy, both the instructions and the corresponding actions were clear. The former mainly relied on lightning to report the enemy's distance in the air, and the artillery and flintlock teams fired according to the instructions. This part was relatively easy, both the instructions and the corresponding actions were clear. For example, solid shells at 800 meters and 500 meters, grape shot shells at 300 meters, flintlock shots at 50 meters, and so on. The key was the field pursuit stage. According to Roland's plan, after the enemy was defeated, it would take the same 3 days to retreat back to Longsong Stronghold. Even if they abandoned the militia and mercenaries and rode back alone, it would take no less than 2 days, so the enemy must camp in the wild. This gave the First Army the opportunity to pursue. With lightning monitoring the whole process, the First Army would follow in a safe area without being discovered by the scouts, and the artillery and ammunition would be transported by Little Town. When the enemy set up camp for the night, the troops would complete the encirclement, and in the early morning, they would launch a pincer attack and annihilate the enemy. The plan did not seem complicated, but in the absence of radio communication, it was almost impossible to separate the troops and launch a joint attack. Roland could only use the witches at this stage to make up for the lack of communication. As for the final result, he was not sure. Another point was that there was not much gunpowder left, so the comprehensive training stage did not carry out live firing, and the main training was the cooperation between the firearms and artillery teams, as well as the cooperation between the First Army and the witches. He had already sent people to the faraway Fallen Dragon Ridge and Redwater City, hoping to find more sources of saltpeter there. If they could not replenish their gunpowder in time, the First Army's muskets could only be used as spears after 2 battles. Roland wrote down some new procurement plans on paper, including saltpeter, grains, seeds, and other materials. He intended to let Berev send another apprentice to Grey Castle to try his luck. There was an abundance of commodities there, especially saltpeter. As summer approached, King City's saltpeter factory would certainly be operating at full capacity. As a city with a large number of nobles and wealthy merchants, once the weather became hot, the consumption of saltpeter would be astonishingly large. He hoped to find a stable supplier that would provide Border Town with a steady supply of gunpowder. Prior to this, he had already sent 2 of his guards to carry out the plan of summoning witches and finding the fruit. The former usually disguised themselves as travelers or merchants, spreading rumors about witches in the streets, pubs, black markets, and other places in Border Town. Of course, the host was not the 4th Prince Roland, but rather the Witch Cooperation Association, which had finally found the Holy Mountain and hoped that the witches would settle there. The latter would directly go to the port of Clearwater and buy the seeds of strange crops from the other side of the fjords. Of course, if there were any rare crops in the cities they passed through, they would also bring back their seeds. After finishing the purchase list, he handed it to Scroll and told her to go to the city hall and hand it over to Berev. After Scroll left, Roland stretched his body and wanted to drink some water, but found that the cup was already empty. When he was about to get up and take the kettle, Nightingale had already brought the kettle to his table. Not only that, she also smiled and filled the cup, and then took the kettle back. Roland slowly took a sip, his heart was puzzled. Recently, Nightingale's attitude was really not right. She always had a smile on her face, and even took the initiative to help him pour tea. Did she want to raise her salary? In the past, she would directly sit on the sofa, holding a plate of dried fish and nibbling it for the whole afternoon. Although Roland had asked for the reason, the other side just smiled and didn't answer, so he simply let it be. Could it be that Gwent could really make people feel happy? In the future, if he made poker and mahjong, and opened an entertainment city, it would simply be waiting to collect money. Stop, Roland shook his head, and put the distracting thoughts to the back of his mind. Now was not the time to be greedy for pleasure, he had to think about what to do after taking over the stronghold. Moving the office center to Longsong Stronghold. Roland thought about this for a long time. Moving the capital to a more prosperous place seemed very tempting, but in fact, it was not a good choice. Longsong Stronghold and Border Town were different. It had been built for more than 100 years, and the forces were intertwined. The territory was managed according to the system of enfeoffment, and even the lord of Longsong Stronghold would find it difficult to stick his hand into other territories. If he wanted to completely transform it into his own territory, it would be almost impossible to achieve without setting off a revolution. Not to mention in that kind of place where crooks mixed with honest folk, his own safety factor could not be guaranteed. He didn't want to be shot by a radical aristocrat while walking on the street. But Border Town was different, the territory was completely under his control. The surrounding land was vast, and there was no urgent need to expand the territory. Most of the people were composed of miners and hunters. After successfully resisting the months of demons, his reputation in this area had also risen. More importantly, after the propaganda of the First Army, which was composed entirely of the people, most of the people accepted the existence of witches. Compared to the church's far-reaching influence in Longsong Stronghold or other urban areas, Border Town could easily develop into a place where witches could live. Therefore, Roland still decided to make Border Town his own core area. As for Longsong Stronghold, he could support other people to manage it, as long as they could provide him with a steady flow of labor and tax revenue. What he lacked the most right now were people and money. Roland's initial idea was to use Longsong Stronghold's money to hire people from Longsong Stronghold to add bricks and tiles to Border Town. The golden dragon that was plundered from the defeated nobles would be returned to the hands of the people, and then collected in Longsong Stronghold through taxes. After Longsong Stronghold handed it over to him, he would then spend it. In addition, he could also use some preferential policies to keep some people with special skills for a long time. However, these were still only a general framework. For example, who to support as an agent, specific tax policies, all these had to wait until the end of the war to consider. At this moment, a yellow figure flew in through the window, and then steadily stopped in front of the prince's table. It was lightning. Chapter 114. The vast Stronghold coalition army slowly walked on the road to Border Town. At the forefront of the army was the Knight Regiment composed of the 6 families of Stronghold. From the armor and dress of each knight, it was easy to see the difference in strength between the families. There was no doubt that the most eye-catching was the knight under the command of Duke Ryan. Their mounts were all short-tailed horses from King's City, good at long-distance running, and bigger than the other horses. Sitting on horseback, the knight looked even more powerful. Their armor was made by the Stronghold's Hammer and Dragon's Teeth blacksmith shop. The thick, shiny silver breastplate was engraved with a huge lion head, and the shoulder armor was engraved with 2 wolf heads, as if they were opening their mouths to roar. The cloak behind them was embroidered with delicate patterns, and the waist was tied with a red silk belt. These knights were not just for show. Every year after the end of the months of the demons, they were responsible for clearing the remaining demonic beasts out of the city to ensure that the land route was smooth. Each of them had accumulated a considerable amount of combat experience. When it came to fighting alone, they were not much worse than the King's Knight Regiment, but they were slightly lacking in numbers. Of course, with the power of the Duke, it was already a very amazing cost to create an elite knight regiment of 150 people. Duke Ryan looked at this sharp division with satisfaction. There was no doubt that with their strength, no one in the western region could stop him. Walking in the middle of the team was the mercenary troops. Their equipment was much inferior in comparison. Most of them wore some old chain mail or plate armor, and they either lacked a gauntlet or a helmet. There were also some people who were only equipped with cheap leather armor and a variety of weapons. They were scattered along the road in 2s and 3s, talking and laughing loudly as they walked. It seemed that this trip was not for fighting, but just for sightseeing. At the end of the team were the freedmen who had been forcibly recruited by the lords. They dragged a wheelbarrow carrying food and tents, and slowly followed behind the mercenaries. Due to the difference in speed, the troop of about 1,500 people was stretched very long. The knight troops at the front had to stop from time to time to wait for the troops behind them to catch up. My lord, the elk Earl Hilt Medra pulled the reins so that he and the Duke were side by side. We still have half a day's journey to Border Town. If all goes well, we should be able to arrive at the dog hour, 4 p.m. At that time, should the troops rest for the night and wait for the next morning before moving, or should they immediately attack the Lord's castle? Don't tell me you want to sleep in the wilderness. At night, I think we should be lying in the castle's big bed, not in the wet mud. Of course, he still had to consider the royal family's reputation. After arriving at Border Town, I will first send an envoy to persuade him to surrender. The Earl of Honeysuckle, who was walking slightly ahead, turned around and said, "The knight's men and horses are tired after a day of walking. Wouldn't it be inappropriate to attack directly? After all, Roland Wimbledon relied on his miners to safely survive the entire months of the demons. I think it's better for us to be cautious. Haha, it's fine if others don't know, but even you don't know the details of the demonic beasts? My old friend. They are indeed terrible in the wild, fast and amazingly strong, but if there is a wall, most of the demonic beasts are just targets. After all, they are just a group of beasts. The Elk Earl shrugged and said, I was surprised that he could build a wall so quickly, but with this alone, it is impossible to resist my knight, right? They are not brainless fools. Exactly. And I also received a message from the north. The Duke of Ryan said casually, this year's Hermes was attacked by a large number of hybrid demonic beasts, and the new holy city almost fell. At present, it is not clear why, but it seems that this year's demonic beasts are heading for the new holy city, and the western region is just a few fish that escaped the net. As the lord of the western region, his eyes were not only focused on this remote area, but also on the major cities and towns for many years, who continuously sent him the latest information. The tragic battle in the north was not the main point. A few days ago, he received a secret report from Cliff City, saying that the new King Timothy and Queen of Clearwater Garcia had a fierce battle in the Eagle City of the southern region, and according to the previous news, Timothy's team should arrive in Eagle City in a month. The letter did not mention the battle, only described that when Timothy returned from Cliff City, there were only a few of the thousands of troops left, and he was even unable to block the road as he did when he came. Some people also saw that Eagle City was set ablaze, and the rising black smoke column was almost at the same level as the clouds, and the residents of the surrounding towns witnessed this spectacle. There was no doubt that, regardless of whether the Queen of Clearwater was killed by Timothy or not, such a tragic loss was a serious blow to the new king. This secret letter made the Duke of Ryan restless, and overnight he sent many of his trusted aides to King's City and the eastern region, hoping to find out Timothy's current situation. If this battle between the two kings had the opportunity to destroy the new king's unstable regime, he absolutely did not mind adding another torch to the fire. If he wanted to be an independent king, now was almost the best opportunity. The soldiers in the north were buried at the foot of the holy city, and the south had just experienced a war, and obviously needed to lie down and lick their wounds. Not to mention the eastern region and King's City, it was likely that they would not be able to recover for a few years. As long as he pulled a group of people to eat the north, he could tear Greycastle in half. At that time, his territory and population would be comparable to the continent's northernmost kingdom of Eternal Winter, and his strength would be able to compete with Greycastle in the southeast. And he, Osmond Ryan, would be the first king of this land. Thinking of this, the Duke showed a proud smile. He hoped that after this farce ended today, tomorrow he would immediately set foot on the road home with the prince. If he was lucky, 3 days later he would be able to receive good news from his trusted aides in the castle. When the sun gradually set in the west, approaching the peak of the mountains, Ryan saw the looming outline of Border Town Castle, and, outside the town, a group of densely packed figures. Father, Your Excellency, Ren Med, who was responsible for leading the way in front of the team, rushed back to report, those people in front should be the fourth prince's guards, they are all armed, and it seems that they do not welcome us. That's good, at least we don't have to bother going to the castle to invite him, the Earl of the Elk family said with a smile. Go inform the knight to slow down, we are still far away from the charging distance. Yes, father, Ren accepted the order and left. Duke of Ryan raised the telescope, looking at the enemy's formation. The team in the mirror looked very strange, they were holding strange weapons, standing next to each other in 2 dense rows. If the weapon was a spear, then it was impossible to see the spear tip, and the grip was too short. Moreover, the enemy's formation was too unreasonable, such a thin line of defense, wouldn't it be easy to break through? This made the Duke a little confused. Even if the prince didn't have any military knowledge, he still had the knight and his guards, it was impossible for them to accompany him, right? After thinking for a moment, the Duke decided to let the mercenaries take the lead, and the knight's troops temporarily stopped in the charging acceleration area to wait for orders, to see what the prince was planning. Of course, the messenger to persuade the prince to surrender was still needed. Duke of Ryan called for a guard. "You go and tell the prince, I have no intention of hurting him, but the decree of King Timothy Wimbledon has arrived, I have no choice but to obey. If he puts down his weapons and surrenders now, he will not suffer any harm, and I will escort him back to King's City in accordance with the treatment of a prince." Chapter 115. When the enemy appeared in his field of vision, Vanner saw those fully armed knight, riding tall horses and wearing shining armor, slowly approaching the town. Usually, a lord knight in the town was a high and mighty existence. Now, nearly 100 of them had come out at once. This scene made him suck in a cold breath. Vanner felt his palms sweating again, just like when he stood on the wall and faced the demonic beasts for the first time, but this time, he was facing the same kind of noble coalition of Longsong Stronghold. That's not right. He spat and threw his thoughts aside. Same kind? When did those nobles treat you as one of their kind? He laughed at himself. This trip was to seize Border Town and bring the North Slope mine back under the control of Longsong Stronghold. More importantly, they even intended to drive His Royal Highness out of the western region, which was unacceptable to all the members of the First Army. Yesterday, His Royal Highness had made it very clear in his speech before the war, that Timothy Wimbledon, His Royal Highness' brother, used tricks to seize the throne and killed the old King Wimbledon III. Originally, Vanner didn't have any opinion on these things between the royal family and the nobles, it didn't matter who became the king. But the Duke Ryan wanted to take this opportunity to take away His Royal Highness' territory, which was too much. Think about it, before His Royal Highness came here, what was Border Town like? The former lord seemed to be an earl, who was rarely seen. When he bought furs, he brought his guards with him, and often bought the good goods from the hunters at low prices. When the months of demons came, he was the first to escape, and when the townspeople suffered in the Longsong Stronghold slums, he never cared about them. Now, under the rule of His Royal Highness, Border Town was getting better and better, these changes were visible to everyone. Vanner thought, the more the miners produced, the more they got paid. After His Royal Highness put the black machine into the North Slope mine, the extra output was still counted as the miners' pay. Whether it was the construction of the wall or the gravel of the mine, the villagers were paid on time. This winter, no one even starved or froze to death. Of course, the biggest change was the militia, now the First Army. With them guarding the town, no one had to curl up in the cold wooden shed of Longsong Stronghold in winter, begging those big shots to give them a mouthful of food. If His Royal Highness was gone, would the Duke allow the First Army to exist? Vanner took 2 deep breaths and wiped his sweat on his clothes. Of course, they would not allow it. The nobles of Longsong Stronghold did not care about the lives of the townspeople. This was exactly what His Royal Highness had said. Only an army composed of the people would be willing to fight for the people. He raised his head and looked at the left side of the sky. There was a black dot circling in the distance. If he didn't look carefully, he would have thought that it was a huge bird. It was Lightning, the firing commander of the artillery team. She used the trees on both sides of the road as cover and observed the enemy's movements from above. When she flew back, Vanner also noticed that as long as she did not take the initiative to fly to the open area, the people below would only see the branches on both sides when they looked up, and it would be very difficult for them to find the witch who was scouting in the sky. Within a quarter of an hour, Lightning had flown close to the front of the formation and flashed a green ribbon. This meant that the enemy had entered the firing range of 1 kilometer. Vanner still did not know how far the 1 kilometer mentioned by His Royal Highness was, but when he saw the green signal, he subconsciously followed the rules of the comprehensive maneuver and shouted the command to load and adjust the firing angle. The 4 artillery teams quickly completed this set of actions, the muzzle was adjusted to the 3rd gear, and the gunpowder and solid shells were loaded into the barrels. Vanner had thought that after standing on the wall and fighting against the demonic beasts, he could already be regarded as experienced, but today he found that compared to Iron Axe and Brian, he was still far behind. In the afternoon, when they were assembling, his heartbeat had been difficult to stabilize. But when the two men led their respective teams into the firing position, they not only looked normal, but he could even hear a trace of eagerness in Brian's voice. But until now, he still had not recovered his calm, and even the Rodney brothers seemed to be performing better than him. This made Vanner somewhat depressed. He licked his dry lips and looked for Lightning's position again. At this time, the enemy suddenly slowed down a lot. "What are they doing?" Rodney asked. "I don't know." Cat's Claw opened his eyes wide and looked around. "It seems that they are adjusting the formation. Their people look a bit messy." "They are waiting for the troops behind them," Jop said with a trembling voice. "It is impossible for Lord Knight to fight alone. There must be a large number of people behind them." "You even know this?" Narsen curled his lips. "I have seen it. A Lord Knight will bring at least 2 squires, as well as a dozen serfs to carry their provisions." He counted with his fingers. "You see, a Duke of Longsong's stronghold has at least 100 knights under his command, right? There are at least 300 people who can fight on horseback. Adding the earls and viscounts in the territory, there are even more. There are also mercenaries. They live on the edge of a knife. They kill without blinking an eye. We only have a total of 300 people." "Less than 300 people," Vanner corrected in his heart. "Only 270 people are equipped with weapons, according to His Highness. This is called insufficient production. Now those who don't have guns have been sent to the artillery team to carry ammunition for the 4 cannons." But seeing that there were still people who performed worse than him, he felt a little better. "That's the mercenaries, they are coming," Jop whispered. Vanner raised his head and looked, only to see a group of people dressed in a variety of clothes gradually occupying the front of the battlefield. They didn't ride on horseback, nor did they line up, but instead gathered in 2s and 3s in the middle of the battlefield. The knights spread out on both sides, seemingly to make way for the mercenaries. Compared to half a quarter of an hour ago, the Duke's coalition army was much closer. At this time, a knight flew out from the coalition army and quickly rushed towards Border Town. Vanner's heart tightened. He almost shouted the command to fire. "What is she doing?" He looked up, but still didn't see Lightning, but the other side was getting closer and closer, while waving a white flag. "He is the messenger sent by the Duke," Jop muttered. "He should be here to persuade us to surrender." "That's none of our business." Rodney squatted down behind the cannon, his line of sight aligned with the center line of the cannon barrel. "Leader, the cannon needs to be adjusted. Most of the knight have already left the battlefield." In the previous live fire practice, they had been repeatedly taught that the attack range of the cannon was in a straight line in front of the muzzle, so if they wanted to hit the target, they had to overlap the target with the center line of the cannon barrel. The 5 of them turned the cannon slightly, until the knight troops at the forefront of the coalition army entered the direction of the muzzle. The messenger who came alone was immediately escorted to the rear of the defensive line by Sir Carter, but Vanner knew that the Duke's move was only a waste of time. His Highness the Prince would never agree to surrender. Suddenly, Lightning sped up and flew towards the town's defensive line, her arms waving, the yellow ribbon in her hands fluttering in the wind. The yellow signal meant that the other side had entered the range of 800 meters. Within this distance, the cannon's solid bullets had a chance to hit the target. As long as the captain of the artillery team didn't indicate that they were forbidden to fire, the artillery teams could freely shoot. Chapter 116. The knight could not charge at the highest speed at the beginning. Horses had limited physical strength and could only maintain high speed for a short period of time. Generally speaking, they would let the horse trot at a distance of 1,000 to 800 meters, gradually accelerate at 500 meters, and finally sprint at 200 meters. When the 12-pound Napoleon cannon fired solid projectiles, the theoretical effective range could reach 1,300 meters. Perhaps because of the short range, the cannon made by Roland was too far away to be seen from a kilometer away. Therefore, he had to open fire at 800 meters. At this time, the accuracy of the cannon was guaranteed, and the shell would still bounce forward after landing, causing line damage. The probability of hitting multiple targets was still relatively high. In order to let the mercenaries go first, Duke of Ryan ordered the knight to wait in the acceleration zone. In the past, this was an absolutely safe zone. Bows and crossbows could not threaten the knight, and the latter had enough distance to increase the speed of the horse. The low efficiency of the mercenaries caused the knights who were already in position to pull their mounts to a halt and wait quietly. For the artillery team, they were almost fixed targets. The Duke did not know that when his troops stepped on this land, they had already fallen into the battlefield that Roland had prepared. The middle road was flat and spacious, and both sides were filled with plants catalyzed by leaf. It looked like an ordinary grassland, but under the knee-high weeds were thick vines, like tripping ropes. If the cavalry wanted to outflank the defensive line, they could only advance at a very low speed. Within a kilometer, the distance was marked by Soroya. It might not be clear on the ground, but in the eyes of Lightning, who was overlooking the whole situation from the air, the battlefield was accurately divided into several sections. Different colored marks represented different distances. The enemy was advancing on a ruler. The artillery team did not need to calculate the angle of the muzzle, they only needed to follow the predetermined steps in the maneuver. The 12-pound cannon of Vanner Group was the first to roar. A large amount of gas produced by the detonation of the gunpowder pushed the projectile outward. When it flew out of the muzzle, it had accelerated to more than 400 meters per second. Almost in the span of 2 breaths, the shell hit the ground with a whistling sound, passed between 2 knight, and fell into the grass beside the road. The splashing soil and gravel startled the horses. One of them did not have time to react and accidentally fell off the horse. The other 2 cannonballs also missed, causing a trail of dust to rise. In the first round of firing, only the last group of cannons was lucky. There was no one in front of the iron ball. A knight happened to pass in front of it when he was controlling his frightened horse. His armor was useless in front of the huge kinetic energy. After the iron ball pierced through the thin iron skin and flesh, it bounced a little on the ground and broke another knight's calf. The knight's horse was also cut open, and its internal organs flowed out on the ground. If the knights were in the normal acceleration phase, they would have adjusted the angle of fire for the next round of bombardment. But this sudden attack had clearly shocked the Duke's coalition army. They did not even know where the attack came from or how it was launched. The speed of the cannonball was beyond the ability of the naked eye. The knight did not receive the order, but he could not see the speed of the shell. The Vanner team completed the reloading process as fast as possible, and the second round of bombardment began. Under the hot weapons, the flesh and blood were exposed to the fragility and softness of the body. Once the iron ball passed by, it would be an irreversible injury. The knights who were hit directly not only had their limbs broken into several pieces, but also blood splattered everywhere. Only when the shell fell to the ground and formed a second ejection, people could faintly see a vague black ghost, wantonly taking the lives of its companions in the crowd. After 2 rounds of bombardment, the Duke finally connected the fire, roars, and inexplicable attacks in the enemy camp. The enemy seemed to have an incredible weapon, whose range was far beyond the crossbow, almost comparable to the fortress's trebuchets. Thinking of this, the Duke ordered his men to blow the horn to attack. As long as the distance was closed, this long-range weapon would basically lose its effect. However, the knight showed a completely different reaction. After hearing the horn, some people began to speed up in the direction of the town, some people were still competing with their horses, and a small number of people had retreated to the rear. Coupled with the swarming mercenaries, the whole scene was chaotic. The attacking knight returned to the main road, and the gunner team immediately became busy. In addition to cleaning the barrel and reloading the ammunition, they also needed to move the gun carriage. At this time, Lightning once again returned to the line of defense, and the ribbon in her hand was replaced by a red one. The red signal meant that the enemy had approached within 500 meters, and at this distance, the cannons could hit more than 80% of the targets. Vanner shouted, "Level the firing angle. Quick, ignite, ignite." After the deafening roar, he did not even have time to observe the results of the battle. and directly turned to the ammunition delivery staff and shouted, "Shotgun, send the shotgun up." In the artillery training, His Royal Highness had repeatedly stressed that if a red signal was seen and the barrel was loaded with solid shells, they should immediately fire and load the shotgun. If it had not been loaded, they should change to the shotgun, and wait for the enemy to enter the range of 300 meters before shooting. The canister shell looked like a barrel-shaped tin can filled with finger-sized iron pellets and sawdust. The diameter of the can was smaller than the barrel, so after filling the canister shell, an extra thin piece of wood had to be stuffed in before the canister shell was filled. When they waited for lightning to send the purple signal, the 4 cannons almost simultaneously opened fire. This was also the first time that Vanner used the shotgun for live firing. According to His Royal Highness, the shotgun was not easy to recover after being shot, so he only practiced the procedure without igniting it. Today was the first time that he witnessed the amazing damage caused by this special shell. After the tin barrel flew out of the muzzle, because of the huge pressure difference, the iron balls inside rained down on the enemy, and the night within 300 meters was suddenly covered by a metal storm. Blood spurted out of the bodies of the men and horses, and they instantly fell down like wheat being cut down. Some iron balls still had a lot of kinetic energy after penetrating the human body, so the overlapping targets could not escape this disaster. The knight, who were lucky enough not to be covered by the barrage, finally approached the sprinting distance. There was only one thought in their minds, that was to break through this thin line of defense, and slaughter those cowards who only knew how to hide behind the line of defense and use evil weapons. It only took a short 20 breaths to cross the last 150 meters. The remaining knight lowered their bodies and accelerated their horses to the highest speed. However, this 150 meters seemed to be close in front of them, but it was actually an unreachable distance. The last round of shotgun fire completely destroyed the fighting will of the knight. Within a range of 100 meters, the iron balls, which were not easily deformed, could already penetrate 2 or 3 people. The conical area in front of the muzzle became the domain of the Grim Reaper, and almost none of the more than 20 knight who rushed at the front was spared. The only difference was that they were hit by a few bullets. The team collapsed. There was no way to recover the team that had collapsed because of fear. The knight in the back turned their horses around and wanted to escape from the battlefield. Seeing the knight regiment scattering in all directions, the mercenaries were naturally not willing to take a step forward. They had always worked for money, and they would never risk their lives to do this kind of unprofitable business. Now that it was time to retreat, the mercenaries ran away much faster than when they came. The tide of defeat engulfed the Duke of Ryan's coalition forces, and the situation quickly became out of control. The people squeezed back and fled, and those who were pushed down were trampled to death. No one had time to care about others, and they only hated themselves for not having 2 more legs. Chapter 117. This was the first time Carter Lannis had seen such a battle. More than 300 knight had formed a huge lineup, but they had not even touched the edge of the defensive line before they were completely defeated. Until the end, they were not able to enter the 50-meter range, that was the firing line drawn by His Highness. Only after crossing the 50-meter range were they allowed to open fire. 4 cannons forcibly contained the opponents within the 100-meter range. Within the 150 to 100-meter range, there were 20 corpses lying in disorder, and these people, like himself, were all skilled knight. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for them to control the horses to move forward at high speed under the roar of the cannons. Carter was glad that he was not one of them. He had a faint premonition that the future war would become very different, and with such a powerful force, Roland Wimbledon would ascend to the throne sooner or later. After seeing the tragic battlefield, a few people in the First Army began to feel dizzy, vomiting and other adverse reactions, but because it was not close combat, the shock of killing the enemy with cannons was less than that of killing the enemy with a blade, so the reaction was not serious. Carter selected a group of hunters who were accustomed to seeing severed limbs and blood to collect the bodies of the dead, and at the same time to search for those who were still alive. The sun gradually set behind the mountains. Carter looked at the blood-red sky, and the crows in the distant woods. He suddenly felt a trace of desolation. The era of the night was over. Duke of Ryan had not been able to come back to his senses. He did not understand how they were defeated. The line of defense was obviously as thin as a cicada's wing, as long as a light poke could penetrate it, but the knights scattered in all directions as if they had seen the devil. In fact, he couldn't even blame others, because the ones who charged at the forefront were the elite knights under his command. His personal guards cut down several people, making the swarming mercenaries avoid the Duke's position, but that was all. No matter how much he roared, he was unable to control his defeated subordinates. In desperation, Duke of Ryan had to follow the flow of people to retreat. This retreat was nearly 10 miles. When night fell, the Duke chose a place near the river bank to set up camp. The missing knight and mercenaries followed the torches and approached, but most of them were still missing. To make matters worse, the freedmen had not hesitated to leave their carts and provisions behind in their retreat, and tonight they had to kill a few horses for their provisions. In the largest tent in the camp, the nobles of the 5 families gathered together and looked at Duke Ryan with pale faces. The latter did not look any better. Can anyone tell us what kind of new weapon they are using? It's farther away than a crossbow, and it's not like a catapult where you can see the thrown stones. He glanced at Ren Med. You were also at the front, did you see anything? My lord, I don't know. Ren held his head. I only heard the roar, and then they fell in batches, especially the last sound. The knight who rushed to the front seemed to suddenly hit an invisible wall. I saw his body shake, and then his head and arms were torn apart, just like... He thought for a moment, an egg thrown from the top of a castle. Is it a witch? The Earl of the Elk family whispered. Impossible, the Duke said, frowning. My knight is wearing a god's stone of retaliation. A witch can't hurt them. It's not like you haven't played with a witch, in front of a god's stone. What's the difference between them and an ordinary woman? By the way, my lord, Ren suddenly seemed to remember something. Before I heard the loud noise, I saw a few cart-like things in their formation. On the cart there were huge iron pipes, which emitted red light and smoke. Iron pipes? Red light and smoke? Isn't that just a ceremonial bucket? The Earl of the Elk family wondered. The Duke, of course, knew what a ceremonial bucket was. In the past, only the nobles in King's City used it during major celebrations, but now almost every lord had one or two. In his castle, there was a pair of bronze ceremonial buckets, which would explode when put in snow powder. But compared to the soul-stirring thunder today, that sound was far inferior. The ceremonial bucket will not let the knight fall apart, the Earl of Honeysuckle said. No matter what weapon the prince used, we have already lost. What should we do next? The Duke of Ryan glanced at him with displeasure. The word, lost, was particularly harsh to him. We haven't lost yet, he emphasized. A disadvantageous battle can't change the final result. As long as we return to Longsong's stronghold, I can recruit another team, and at the same time cut off the trade on the Redwater River. Without food, Border Town won't last for more than a month. As long as he dares to bring those villagers out, my knight can defeat him from the side and behind. Victory will eventually belong to me, he thought, but the losses I've suffered are not something a small town can make up for. If I want to take the northern region again, it's almost impossible. Damn it! If I can catch Roland Wimbledon, I must tear him to pieces. But my lord, the fleet on the Redwater River is not only from Longsong's stronghold, but also from Willow Town, Fallen Dragon Ridge, and Redwater City. If we intercept all of them, won't it be? The Earl of Honeysuckle hesitated. I'll buy them all, as long as I pay them. It doesn't matter who they sell them to, the Duke said coldly. Everyone go back to their tents and sleep. We'll set out tomorrow morning. The knight with a horse will go with us, and the one without a horse will stay behind and be responsible for leading the mercenaries. It was impossible to march at night. Even if the fourth prince planned to pursue them, he would have to set out at dawn, and the first thing he would encounter would be the mercenaries left behind. He thought, even if this group of waste collapsed at the first touch, they would still be able to buy him a lot of time. The next day, the Duke didn't receive any news that the prince had caught up. In order to confirm this news, he sent his trusted aides to expand the scope of the investigation, and the results were the same. This made him feel a little relieved, probably because the new weapons were as difficult to move as the trebuchets, and could only be used in a defensive battle. Relying only on a group of miners with wooden sticks, the prince didn't dare to act rashly. At 3:00 in the afternoon, the Duke ordered the knight to stop and wait for the people behind to catch up. When it was nearly dusk, the mercenaries and freedmen caught up with the cavalry one after another. Everyone was busy again, circling a piece of land and hastily setting up tents. As long as he could get through this night, he would be able to rush to Longsong's stronghold tomorrow. The 3-feet-high bluestone wall was like a natural moat for hundreds of troops. Even if the other side had a very long range of new weapons, he could still use the trebuchets behind the wall to counterattack. This account, he would definitely settle with the prince. But what made the Duke of Ryan a little uncomfortable was that, all the way today, he always felt like he was being stared at. It's probably an illusion, he thought, I'm too nervous. The next morning, the Duke was awakened by the sound of cannons. When he rushed out of the tent, he found that everyone was covering their heads and scurrying away. From time to time there would be mud and blood splashing everywhere. Looking to the west, he saw the militia, wearing standard leather armor lined up in a straight line, quietly standing outside the camp. In the midst of the deafening roar, there was only one thought left in the Duke's mind: how did they catch up? Yesterday, the knight who was responsible for the investigation didn't see the pursuers. Your Excellency the Duke, let's go. The guard shouted loudly as he brought a horse. Osmond Ryan woke up from his daze. He turned over and mounted the horse, following the guard to the east. However, not long after they left the camp, they saw another unit that looked exactly the same. They were wearing the same standard leather armor, holding strange short sticks in their hands, arranged in a neat row. Even their expressions looked the same. Chapter 118. Although Roland had the First Army train twice a week, he had never tried to march at night. It was dangerous to dispatch troops at night. They couldn't see the road clearly, they could easily be attacked by wild beasts and poisonous snakes, and it was easy to get lost. Holding a torch was simply a natural target. Therefore, he had to wait until dawn the next day to set off with the Duke's coalition army. In order to ensure the smooth operation, the prince decided to follow the First Army. Of course, compared to the bumpy and rubbing but riding, he chose to accompany them on Little Town. After half a month of training, Hummingbird was able to control the duration of the 12-pound cannon Lightning within a fixed range. Taking into account the long enchantment process, Roland arranged for her to transform the cannon at dawn, so that the first cannon could last the longest, and the remaining cannons successively decreased in order to ensure that the 4 lightning cannons lost their effectiveness as much as possible. Thanks to Hummingbird's ability, Little Town could now carry 4 cannons and their crew members at a time. The huge cement ship was full of people. In addition to the artillery team and Roland, Anna, Nightingale, Nana, Leaf, Echo, Hummingbird and Sir Pine were also aboard Little Town. Vendy was responsible for providing the power, and Brian was the helmsman. It could be said that, except for Scroll, Soroya, Lily and Mystery Moon who weren't good at fighting, almost all the witches in Border Town came out in full force. Originally, Anna didn't need to go to the battlefield, but her firm eyes made Roland unable to be ruthless in the end. The land troops were the First Army's firearm team, led by Chief Knight Carter and Iron Axe, while Lightning was responsible for the whole tracking mission. A group of people quietly followed behind the enemy. The distance between them was just outside the patrol range of the cavalry scouts. Once Lightning discovered the activity of the cavalry scouts, the army would stop moving forward. Along the way, they also captured a lot of scattered mercenaries and freedmen, but at the moment there was no way to deal with these surrendered enemies, so after disarming them, they were taken care of by the team members who didn't have firearms. This was also the first time that Roland led an army on an expedition against the enemy. He stood on the bow of Little Town, feeling the head-on morning breeze, feeling quite proud of himself. "What are you laughing at?" Anna suddenly appeared beside him and asked. "Ah." Roland's smile disappeared instantly. "Nothing." "Really?" She handed him a handkerchief. Wipe your saliva. Roland suddenly felt an urge to jump into the water. Thank you. When Lightning reported that the other party had set up camp, it was already sunset. Compared to the previous continuous reconnaissance, it was obvious that the morale of the Allied forces had dropped to a freezing point after experiencing a huge defeat. Just as dusk fell, the knight who was in charge of the reconnaissance rushed back to the camp in a hurry, afraid that he would miss the horse meat at night. Roland's troops were stationed on the shore 2 kilometers away from the Duke's army. Since they hadn't been discovered along the way, the annihilation plan was already half a success. Next, they just had to wait for the sky to brighten and complete the encirclement before the enemy set out. This was also Roland's first time spending the night in the wild. Compared to the camp full of reptiles, he was more inclined to sleep on the boat. The wooden shed where the artillery was parked was emptied, and the members of the artillery team unloaded the 12-pound cannon and lived in the camp. Little Town became the prince's temporary palace. In addition to Roland, the other witches also stayed on the boat for the night. Everyone covered the shed with mattresses and lay down side by side with their clothes. Roland wanted to be reserved, but he found that the witches didn't care about it at all. In addition to Anna, they had all suffered a lot. During the days when they were homeless, sleeping in the wild was a common thing. After a while, everyone fell asleep. Only Roland and Anna found it difficult to fall asleep. The former was used to a soft bed, so it was difficult for her to adapt to the hard deck bed. Anna, on the other hand, seemed to be thinking about something. She kept tilting her head and looking at Roland. When the prince turned his head, Anna would quickly close her eyes and pretend to be asleep. But under the moonlight, her eyelashes could still be seen trembling slightly. If it wasn't for fear of waking up the others, Roland really wanted to pinch the tip of her nose, force her to open her eyes, and then hold her in his arms. In this way, the two of them almost didn't sleep for the whole night. Before the sun rose, Roland launched his plan to divide the troops and surround them. The 270 infantry with guns would be divided into 2 groups. One of the groups would be equipped with 2 cannons, and would be sent by Little Town to the rear of the Duke's army. They would complete the defense 1 kilometer away. Lightning was responsible for monitoring the Duke's movements. When the cannons were set up, the little girl would give the signal. At this moment, Carter would lead the remaining troops to attack from the front. The transportation of cement boats would avoid the possibility of being separated during the march. After entering the fog, Nightingale's black and white vision could be used as a night vision device. With her as the navigator, Little Town would have the ability to navigate during the day. This set of procedures had been repeatedly practiced, so everyone knew what to do even with their eyes closed. Vendi increased the output of the wind, and Little Town, as if riding the wind and breaking the waves, transported the troops in batches to the rear. About an hour later, Iron Axe led the intercepting troops in position. Lightning flew over Carter's camp and flashed the orange flag. At this time, the sky was just beginning to break. The encirclement and annihilation plan officially began. Because Echo was assigned to the rear, the musketeers responsible for the frontal attack didn't need to move to fight. They only needed to line up in a battle line and protect the 2 cannons. The 12-pound cannons were quickly pushed into position and fired at the enemy camp. At this time, most of the Duke's army was still asleep. Along with the rumbling sound of the cannons, solid shells whistled towards the camp. The knight and the mercenaries, who had just woken up from a dream, rushed out of the tent, only to find that the First Army had already lined up and were quietly waiting in place. With the experience of the previous day's fiasco, no one dared to challenge this seemingly thin line of defense. They could only flock to the east and flee. Iron Axe had been waiting for a long time behind them. When the enemy appeared in their field of vision, the encirclement and annihilation plan finally reached the moment to close the noose. With Echo playing marching music, the 150 people of the First Army stepped on the drums, lined up in 2 neat rows, and marched towards the enemy. In order to create pressure on the Duke's army, Iron Axe, who was responsible for intercepting, had to take the initiative to attack. If they stuck to their original position, the enemy was likely to abandon their mounts and take a detour to escape through the woods. The Duke of Ryan had already fallen into despair. He simply could not understand how the enemy had appeared behind them. Admit defeat and surrender. He did not know how Roland Wimbledon would deal with a duke who dared to show his sword to the royal family. Perhaps he would be imprisoned, perhaps exiled, or even directly sent to the guillotine. No matter what, Longsong's stronghold would have nothing to do with him in the future. Seeing the troops approaching step by step, as well as the terrifying weapons behind them, he knew that if he did not rush forward now, he would never have the chance to do so again. There were only 30 people left. This was his last chance. They can't stop us, the Duke roared. As long as we cross this horizontal line, they will not be able to catch up with us on foot. We are only half a day away from Longsong's stronghold. Knight, charge with me. Then the Duke began to urge his mount to speed up, but unfortunately, not everyone had the spirit to fight to the death. Only 10 people, including his personal guards, followed him in the charge. However, he could not afford to care so much now. The music came to an abrupt end. The other side stopped in unison, standing in front of him like a wall. Then he saw those people raise the short sticks in their hands. When the Duke of Ryan was only 100 steps away from the human wall, a series of banging sounds rang out. He felt a fierce shock in his chest and abdomen, as if he had been hit by a sledgehammer. Then came a feeling of paralysis and powerlessness. His body leaned back and fell from the horse's back to the ground. Chapter 119. Perrault Hull sat at his desk, subconsciously fiddling with a beautiful piece of parchment in his hand. It was the program list sent by the Longsong Theatre every weekend afternoon. Usually, he would choose a favorite play, let the housekeeper pay a deposit, and then send the invitation to Shirley. But now, he did not read a word. Today was the 7th day of the expedition. If everything went well, his father should have returned with the Duke yesterday. Maybe he was delayed on the road, or maybe he was tired and rested in border town for an extra day. He comforted himself, but the uneasiness in his heart was slowly growing. Roland Wimbledon, the 4th prince, had left a deep impression on him. Perrault even felt it was inconceivable that such an outstanding prince had such a terrible reputation in King's City. Bad character, dandy, incompetent, ignorant and incompetent, any evaluation was different from the prince he knew. That was why his uneasiness was so strong. He was afraid that the Duke would lose to him. Young Master Perrault, the housekeeper shouted outside the door, there is a letter from Stronghold. From Stronghold? Perrault was stunned. Bring it in. Peeling off the cover, the first sentence on the letter left Petrov dumbfounded. This was a letter from Prince Roland. Duke Osmond Ryan attacked this king's territory with force and attempted to rebel, but failed. The Duke himself was executed on the battlefield, and now Longsong's stronghold is in my hands. The Duke was defeated. His heart sank, and he continued to read. Except for a few diehards, most of Duke Ryan's accomplices had surrendered and pleaded guilty. Those who rebelled against the royal family should have been executed, but I am merciful and only executed the ringleaders and unforgivable people. The rest of the participants can redeem the captives with money according to the past war custom. The place of exchange is the Lord's Castle of Longsong Stronghold. The following is the list. The wording of this official document was extremely awkward, and it was not the common diplomatic language, but the meaning was clear. The Duke failed in his rebellion and wanted captives. Redeem them with money. Perrault looked down slightly, and his father's name appeared in the first row. Hades. He shouted the housekeeper's name. Prepare the carriage, I'm going to Stronghold Castle. Count Honeysuckle's territory was to the east of Stronghold. When Perrault arrived at the castle district, it was already half an hour later. In front of the Lord's castle stood the militia that he had never seen before. They did not have shiny armor, nor did they have capes or ribbons. In their hands, they held a strangely shaped short stick with a sharp spear at the top. Just by standing neatly in 2 rows with their heads held high and chests puffed out, he felt an oppressive aura. After reporting his identity, Perrault was led into the courtyard and led to the castle hall by a guard. He had been to this place many times, but today, it was as if he had stepped into a completely unfamiliar territory. The guards standing guard in the hallway were all faces he had never seen before. No one nodded or smiled at him, and they were all expressionlessly sizing him up. At the entrance of the hall, a knight came to greet him. "Your name?" "Perrault Hull," Perrault replied a little unhappily. He did not like such an interrogative conversation, so he emphasized again, "Sir Hull." "Oh." The other looked disapproving and flipped through the name list in his hand. "Count Chalafil Hull is your father." "Excuse me," the knight said, but there was not a trace of apology on his face. "I am Carter Lannis, the chief knight of Prince Roland. Please come to the side room first, we need to check if you are carrying any weapons." After a search, Perrault's god's stone of retaliation was also taken down by the guards. "That's not a weapon," Perrault reminded. "Of course not." The knight nodded. "We will return it to you after the meeting. Don't worry." He opened his mouth, but in the end, he held it back. Return? That god's stone of retaliation could be regarded as a high-grade item. It was worth at least 50 golden dragons. It was simply impossible for it to not be exchanged for a defective item. "Forget it," he thought, "I'll just take it as part of the ransom." Entering the hall, Roland saw Prince Roland sitting in the main seat, writing something. When he looked up and saw Perrault, he was startled for a moment, then smiled and said, "We meet again, Mr. Ambassador." It was still a familiar face and tone. Perrault also relaxed a little. He bowed and said, "Greetings, Your Highness. Sit down." Roland raised his hand and motioned him to take a seat. "You must already know what happened. Your father was not harmed in any way. He was one of the first to surrender." "Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness," Perrault said quickly. "I don't know how much ransom Your Highness wants. As long as Honeysuckle can pay, I will immediately send the money." "I don't need money," Roland shook his finger. "I want livestock and people." It was normal to want livestock. Even 50 years ago, when conflicts broke out between the lords, the loser would compensate the cattle and sheep. Perrault had read about this more than once in the book. But, what does he mean by asking for people? "Your Highness, cattle, sheep, horses, there are a lot of them in Honeysuckle's territory. As for the people you mentioned, it's very simple. I want masons, stonemasons, carpenters, farmers, and serfs." The prince handed over a roll of paper. "You can convert them according to the value above. As long as the total is 3,000. He smiled. "By the way, because His Excellency the Count is regarded as the one who captured the most titles, his value is also the highest." Perrault spread the roll of paper in front of the table. He saw that it was full of professions and livestock types, followed by a number, such as, cattle 3, sheep 2, stonemasons 10, and so on. He immediately understood what the other side meant. The value of 3,000 meant that 1,000 cattle, or 300 stonemasons, were needed to redeem his father. Of course, his territory didn't have so many cattle and stonemasons. Moreover, just by arranging the items on the paper, there would be many choices. As a noble who dealt with trade every day, Perrault instantly realized that there was a lot to be done. As long as he was given a few days' time, he would be able to calculate the optimal solution and meet the requirement of 3,000 points at the lowest cost. "Your Highness, one day, I can only give you 1 day," Roland stretched out a finger. "This refers to the time you have to make a choice. After all, if you want to gather so many materials and people, it will take at least 3 or 4 days. Moreover, I won't stay here forever. After a week, I will leave this place. But 1 day is really Perrault suddenly froze and stared at the prince. Wait, you just said, you want to leave. What does that mean? If the letter isn't wrong, the Duke has already died on the battlefield. Longsong's stronghold belongs to His Highness, but he actually said he wants to leave. Is this place not comparable to that small and shabby border town? No, this isn't the point. The point is, if His Highness leaves, who will manage this magnificent city? A storm was set off in Roland's heart. Will it be inherited by the Duke's children? Thinking about it, this is absolutely impossible. Will I wait for them to reassemble the army to avenge my father? In addition to the Ryan family, the 5 families, or the other noble families? Yes, Roland nodded. I will take the ransom and return to Border Town. Roland's heart suddenly surged with an idea. Once this idea appeared, it could no longer be suppressed. Chapter 120. Roland looked at Perrault with great interest and suddenly laughed. You are the first person to ask me this question. He took a sip of water from his cup and said in a relaxed tone, Longsong's stronghold is undoubtedly mine, even if I'm not here. However, I do need a person or a family to manage the stronghold for me. So, what you should ask is not the ransom, but the agency fee. Agent. Perrault was no stranger to this word. Some sharp-eyed merchants always stared at the nobles who had a large output in their territory, but had no time or disdain to do business. In order to obtain this right, they had to pay a sum of money in advance as a deposit. How many pieces of golden dragon do you want? He took a deep breath and calmed himself down. This is a long-term process, so there is no need to pay it all at once. Roland paused. 30% of the stronghold's tax revenue every month, as well as 1,000 pieces of supplies, the rest is yours. It's not outrageous, Perrault thought, as long as I can completely occupy Longsong's stronghold, such a price can even be said to be fair. The other side is not joking, he confirmed this point, His Royal Highness really intends to do this. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Perrault told himself in his heart. He and the prince were not enemies, the Duke had been completely defeated, and his children would be deprived of their inheritance. If the coalition of the 6 families could not defeat the prince, who else could stop him from actually owning the Western Territory? Relying on a powerful force was the basic rule for the continuation of the aristocracy. If they could get His Royal Highness approval before the other 4 families, the Honeysuckle family would become the largest aristocratic family in the Western Territory. Your Royal Highness, why don't you stay here? This castle is much larger than the one in Border Town. You actually want to ask why I don't manage the stronghold myself, don't you? Roland looked at the slightly embarrassed Perrault and said with a smile, there are many reasons. For example, the forces here are too complicated, and it would take me a long time to straighten out the relationship between them, not to mention to profit from it. If I support a local aristocrat, presumably he knows better than me how to govern this place, this is a win-win deal. In addition, there are many reasons, you can go back and think about it slowly. The prince toyed with the silver cup. By the way, if I choose you as my agent, you won't take revenge on me for the Duke, right? Of course not, Your Highness. Although the last question was a little abrupt, Perrault still replied immediately. Now that the Duke was gone, the first thing the 5 families thought of was how to divide his territory. Who cared about revenge? However, Perrault also knew that the reasons given by Her Highness were not the real reasons. The forces were too complicated and difficult to straighten out. In the face of overwhelming power, he could completely eliminate the opposition forces. In 1 to 2 years, all the nobles would forget the loser Ryan, just like what Ryan had done in the past. But 2 years was absolutely not enough to build Border Town into a big city like Longsong's stronghold. His Highness Roland must have a deeper plan. That's good. Then, this city, I'm willing to represent you, Your Highness. Perrault blurted out, but soon his expression became hesitant. But, the king, no, I mean your brother, may not necessarily agree with this result. If he assigns a new duke to the Western Territory, I will be powerless to fight against King's City. You don't need to fight, Roland threw 2 letters in front of him. Look at this, and also the documents I found in the Duke of Ryan's study. Perrault quickly scanned the contents of the letters and couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. The first letter looked like a secret letter. The new King Timothy fought with the Queen of Clearwater in Eagle City and suffered a major defeat. The content of the second letter was even more frightening. Only half of the letter was written, but the Duke of Ryan's intention to annex the Northern Territory and become an independent king had already been expressed on the paper. Because there was no end, it was not clear who this letter was to be sent to. He immediately understood His Royal Highness's meaning. There was no need to resist, because the new king was already too busy to take care of himself. Otherwise, the Duke would never want to raise the flag and become independent. His elite knight regiment was enough to conquer the Western Territory, but compared to King City's knight regiment, it was still far from enough. The secret letter may have been forged, but this document was indeed Osmond Ryan's handwriting, unless the prince found a witch who could imitate other people's handwriting. He thought for a moment, then immediately denied this speculation. There was no need for the other party to go through so much trouble to deceive him. Acting as the agent of Longsong's stronghold wasn't a one-sided deal. If he couldn't gain a foothold in Longsong's stronghold, His Royal Highness wouldn't be able to benefit either. Moreover, the Duke appointed by Timothy would inevitably be the enemy of the fourth prince. If the Honeysuckle family wanted to be above the 4 big families, they would have to rely on the prince's support. On the other hand, in order to ensure that the treaty wouldn't be abolished, the prince would also have to make the Hull family sit in this position more stable. Thinking of this, Perrault slowly stood up and bowed to Roland. The Hull family is willing to serve you. Very good, the latter nodded, but now I can't decide who will be your agent. First, I'll ask you a few questions. Your Highness, please ask. How do you plan to deal with the forces that oppose you? What is your estimate of the monthly tax revenue? How can you guarantee 1,000 points of goods? If I ask you to vigorously develop trade, what measures will you take? Perrault originally thought that His Highness just wanted to take this opportunity to understand the information of the various nobles in the Western Territory. He didn't expect that the other would actually ask such strange questions. It was as if he was testing his administrative means and business knowledge. After a series of questions, Perrault racked his brain to answer them one by one, and His Highness's expression became more and more satisfied. Finally, he clapped his hands and said, "Good, that's all for today. When you confirm the ransom of 3,000 points, you can come and redeem the Earl. Rest assured, I will entertain him well in the next few days. Your Highness, the agency, it will also be revealed on that day." Roland gestured to the knight to see him off. Perrault walked out of the hall with a complicated mood, and then saw Carter put the god's stone of retaliation back into his hand. It was still the same bright blue one, the one that was worth 50 golden dragon stones. How was it? Roland looked at Nightingale, who had just appeared beside him. Well, what I said was basically the truth, she shrugged. I was much more sincere than the previous few. By the way, is it really okay for you to repeat the same words to everyone? And those letters, the contents are all confidential. Not everyone, the prince looked at the list in his hand. They are all from the 5 big families, and only these great nobles are suitable to manage the stronghold on my behalf. If they are not strong enough, even if they sit in this position, they will not be able to operate the stronghold, and will only cause the various forces to fall into endless internal strife. As for the news of Timothy Wimbledon's defeat in Eagle City, it is not a secret. Sooner or later this news will spread throughout the whole Grey Castle. What I have to do is to make it spread a little faster. And these 2 pieces of news really came at the right time, he thought. If the second prince had not suffered such a crushing defeat, I am afraid I would have to spend a lot of effort to recruit an agent, and if I had used coercive means, the result might not have been so good. So, you have chosen him. If nothing unexpected happens. Roland said with a smile, he is the first person to take the initiative to ask me about this matter. Subjective initiative has always been the most important quality of an employee. And I did not expect that the 5 big families would have someone so proficient in administration and trade. I thought they only knew how to ride horses and kill. Chapter 121. When all 5 families had been questioned, Roland gently breathed a sigh of relief. He leaned back in his chair, and Nightingale took the initiative to walk behind him, stretching out her hands to massage his shoulders. From defeating the Duke to entering the city and occupying the Lord's castle, it only took 1 day. Things went smoother than he had imagined. After the Duke's death, most of the people chose to surrender. The mercenaries even changed sides and knelt on the ground, expressing their willingness to work for His Royal Highness. So the mercenaries guarded the surrendered knight and nobles, and the First Army guarded the mercenaries. A group of people marched towards the east and arrived at Longsong's stronghold at 3:00 in the afternoon. When the guards at the gate saw the head of the Duke of Ryan and a large group of captured nobles, they immediately opened the gate and welcomed the 4th prince into the city. Roland didn't summon all the nobles in the city with great fanfare to announce the ownership of the city. Instead, he immediately went to the Lord's castle. The castle was located in the center of the stronghold at the highest point, just like a city within a city. When they entered the castle area, a small-scale battle broke out. After Nightingale blew up the garden gate with a bag of explosives, more than 20 guards who didn't follow the Duke tried to stop Roland from entering, but were killed by the First Army. When the other side stubbornly resisted, they used crossbows, causing 5 soldiers to be injured, 2 of which were seriously injured. Fortunately, Nana, who accompanied the army, immediately healed them. There were also 10 guards who wanted to secretly escape with the Duke's family through the back door of the castle, but they were discovered by Lightning, who was monitoring from the air, and were immediately surrounded and arrested. The Duke's wife and 2 sons were captured. Until now, they were still in the dark, ignorant of the news of the Duke's defeat. After taking control of the Lord's castle, the First Army of Border Town immediately took over the defense of the castle area. It had to be said that the Duke of Ryan's castle was 3 or 4 times larger than the one in Border Town, and its shape was also much more magnificent. 6 watchtowers formed a hexagonal outline, and the main tower in the middle was almost 5 stories high. In this era, it was a rare high-rise building. The garden was equipped with residential warehouses and stables, and there was even a private prison in the castle basement. He packed the valuable prisoners and the Duke's family into the cells, dismissed the civilians, confiscated the weapons of the mercenaries, and placed them in the spare rooms in the garden. At the same time, he picked out a few leaders, gave them high salaries, and let them look after themselves. In Roland's eyes, the North Slope mine was the best home for these opportunists, but he had more important things to do now. That was the most important loot after a battle, commonly known as looting. Roland took a group of witches and searched the castle from top to bottom. He didn't even let go of the god's stone of retaliation that was placed in the vault and the secret room. After a thorough search, the results were simply touching. Just the 2 big boxes of golden dragon found in the basement storage were conservatively estimated to contain as many as 10,000 golden dragon pills. Nightingale found dozens of eyeball-sized gems in the secret compartment of the bedroom, while Echo found a dark room behind the fireplace. After entering the secret chamber, not only were there all kinds of gold handicrafts, such as scepters and crowns, but there were also many dazzling pieces of jewelry that were neatly hung on the wooden shelves on the wall. This was the financial resources of a duke. Roland looked at this huge wealth, and then thought of Border Town's autumn and winter revenue of less than 500 golden dragon ores. His heart was filled with emotion. This was the allure of plundering. If he didn't come from a highly developed industrial society, he was afraid that he would also be addicted to it. But even though he was emotional, he still had to accept these things. In the foreseeable future, Border Town's labor population would increase significantly, and before the development of agriculture in his territory, he needed a large amount of money to import food from other places. Therefore, Hummingbird lightened the boxes of treasures, and Iron Axe and the prince's personal guards were responsible for escorting them. Through Border Town, they would bring the spoils of war back to their castle and store them there. Taking into account the time needed to enchant the large items, it would take about 3 days to transport them all. This was also the reason why the next day, Roland decided not to ask for the golden dragon as a ransom. He had already benefited a lot from eating a duke, but now he needed living people and livestock. "Your Highness, are you really only going to stay here for a week?" Nightingale asked. "What's wrong?" Roland closed his eyes, enjoying the bursts of soreness coming from his shoulders. "Is this the largest city in the western region?" She whispered, "Compared to Border Town, don't you want to stay in this more prosperous place? Longsong Stronghold's forces are complex, and it's not suitable for what I want to do. It's better to maintain the status quo, but if I want to make changes, I will only encounter more and more resistance, and now I can't brutally eradicate them all." Roland smiled. "Of course, the most important thing is that the people here are deeply influenced by the church, and it will be difficult for them to accept you in a short time. I have said that I hope witches can walk freely on the streets, and Border Town has now achieved this." "Well," Nightingale softly said, "you have fulfilled your promise." On the morning of the third day, Perrault hurriedly brought his list, and Roland received him in the hall as usual. "Your Highness, I have chosen." "Let me have a look." Roland took the list. Similar to what he had expected, the list was filled with serfs with a value of 2 points, about 800 people, 100 cows, and 300 sheep accounted for a total of 900 points, and the rest were all kinds of craftsmen. "Your Highness, is this okay?" "Of course, as long as you have enough points, it's okay." Roland returned the list to Perrault. "When can you gather these people and supplies?" "Today is possible. This is the arrangement I made according to the property and people of the Honeysuckle family territory. But Your Highness, if you want to bring them back to Border Town, it may take about half a month." "This will have to be done by yourself." Roland knocked on the table. "You should have the experience of organizing caravans, right?" "Yes, Your Highness." Perrault hesitated. "Then my father, you can bring him back today," the prince said with a smile, at the same time handing him a parchment roll. "If you feel that there is no problem, sign and leave your fingerprint on it." "This is an agency contract?" Perrault glanced at the beginning, his voice became excited. "Did you agree to grant the agency to the Honeysuckle family?" "Please wait a moment." He spread out the paper roll and began to carefully read the contract. The other side's cautiousness made Roland nod with satisfaction. As a collaborator, paying attention to the contract was the most basic requirement. After a moment, Perrault raised his head. "The content is basically the same as what you told me yesterday, but there is one point." He pointed to the end of the contract. "Your Highness, shouldn't my father's name be written here? He is the Count of the Honeysuckle family, and also the representative of the family." Roland smiled. "Of course not, it was you who discussed the matter of the agency with me, not your father. So, the end of this contract is naturally written with your name." Perrault was startled for a moment. He asked with some disbelief, "Your Highness, do you mean that I should?" Chapter 122. The dungeon of the castle was not as damp and dark as the prison of Border Town. Probably the Duke did not want his basement to become a haunted house, or to smell a disgusting stench when he walked down the stairs. In general, the dungeon was relatively clean. Different cells were decorated differently, some were empty, some not only had beds, but also had wardrobes, desks and chandeliers. Probably the Duke originally used this place as a place to detain some nobles, so basic etiquette must be maintained. Roland also found a special cell in the corner. A large bed occupied half of the room, chains hanging from the ceiling, but the chain head was tied to the iron handcuffs wrapped in a layer of sheepskin, and a variety of whips hung on the wall. "It seems that the Duke Ryan has done some research in some aspects," he thought. "Unfortunately, I will leave here in a few days, so I can't have a good time to figure it out." As the most valuable captive, Shalafil Hull was naturally locked up in the best cell. If you did not look at the iron railings outside, you would think it was a luxurious bedroom. Living with him were the Viscounts of the Maple Leaf and Wolf families, the eldest son of the Wild Rose family and the second son of the Elk family. These families, together with Lion Ryan, formed the 6 families of Longsong Stronghold. Of course, Ryan's faction had been disbanded by Roland, so his wife and son were locked up next door. Seeing His Royal Highness appear in the dungeon, the nobles stood up one after another. Without waiting for them to ask, Roland said, "Count Hull, you can come out. As for the others, when the ransom arrives, I will naturally let you out." Father, Perrault saw the Count's ruddy face and felt relieved. He glanced at his friend and then looked at Roland. "Your Royal Highness, I did not see the name of the Elk family on the list. If he died on the battlefield, their eldest son should still be in King's City, and there is no one who can take charge of the family. Can we first release Ren Med and let him go back to raise the ransom? I am willing to vouch for him." "The eldest son of the Elk family, do you mean Jacques Med?" Roland shook his head. "He came back. Not only did he come back, but he also came to the castle yesterday. But I don't think he intends to pay the ransom." Hearing this, Ren moved closer to the cage in disbelief. "Why? He said you didn't protect father on the battlefield. You were the executioner who killed Count Med. Why would he say something like that?" "The one who killed father was..." Ren suddenly stopped talking. Roland said casually, "You're trying to say that I was the one who killed the Count, right?" He went to the front of the cage. "Before the months of the demons, your father sent people to sneak into my castle, wanting to burn my provisions. Now, he's following the Duke and leading a large group of night knights to attack my territory. I'm just retaliating and repelling the invaders. So am I the murderer?" Compared to the initiator, Duke Ryan, and the accomplice, Earl Med, who should be blamed more? Also, if it wasn't for Hill's confession that you knew nothing about the food burning incident, you would be a dead man by now. Ren was speechless. "Your Royal Highness," Perrault asked worriedly, "if no one is willing to pay the ransom, will you execute him?" "That won't happen, I've always been kind," Roland grinned. "I'll probably bring him back to Border Town and let him work in the North Slope mine for 20 years to atone for his crimes." "How much is the ransom?" "As the second son, he has no chance to inherit the title, so the price is naturally not as high as the Earl of Honeysuckle. Only 1,000 values of materials will do." Roland looked at him with interest. "Why, do you want to pay the ransom for him?" "What value? 1,000 golden dragons." The Earl, who had been released by the guard, interrupted. "Your son will tell you." The prince made a gesture of invitation. "Let's go, there's nothing to stay here. As for the matter of the second son of the Med family, you don't have to worry about it, you can slowly go back and think about it." The group left the dungeon, and when they arrived at the castle gate, the Earl suddenly stopped. "Your Royal Highness, I know that Duke Ryan's behavior is unforgivable, but his wife and son are innocent." "Perhaps," Roland couldn't deny. "I don't intend to sentence them to exile, hang them or anything like that. I will only bring them back to Border Town and imprison them. Until the day I ascend the throne," he thought. "Now is not the time to be soft-hearted. If they are acquitted, it will only muddy the waters of Longsong Stronghold. The eldest son has the legal right to inherit." "What did you say?" Shalafi Hull's eyes widened, incredulously looking at Perrault. "His Royal Highness doesn't intend to live in Longsong Stronghold, and even wants to hand over the city to you?" Back at the Earl's house, Perrault immediately told his father in detail what had happened in the past 3 days. When he heard about the agency contract, the Earl could no longer bear it. After getting a positive answer from his son, he stood up and paced around the study, obviously in a complicated mood. "Father, are you all right?" Perrault asked worriedly. "It seems that our main opponents are the Elk family. Except for them, the other 3 families, whether in terms of background or strength, are inferior to us." "What?" He didn't come back to his senses for a moment. "Opponents, opponents." The Count shouted, "You disappoint me. His Highness has given you such a good opportunity. Haven't you figured out who your opponents are yet?" "Well, don't you find it strange?" "Strange? Why does His Royal Highness insist on returning to Border Town?" Of course it's strange, the Earl touched his beard, but it has nothing to do with us, as long as this contract is real. That's true, Perrault thought, His Royal Highness is going through so much trouble, it's impossible that he just wants to tease me. As for the reason why he loves Border Town, I can think about it later. But he didn't expect his father's ability to accept things was so strong. I heard that the boy from the Med family is your friend. Shalafi suddenly stood still and said, tomorrow you go and get him out. You agree to let me spend 1,000 points to redeem him? Perrault was startled. Think about it, the Earl of the Elk family is dead, the eldest son is unwilling to redeem the second son. In this battle, except for a few knights, there is almost no loss. Once Jacques Med inherits the title, in the future it will inevitably hinder your control, no, the management of Longsong Stronghold. The Earl explained, why is Jacques unwilling to redeem Ren? Because he is afraid that the other party will threaten him. Well, it turned out to be for this reason. Perrault smiled bitterly in his heart. But he knew that what his father said was right. Ren loved swords and spears since he was a child, and he was very close to the knight in the territory, unlike the eldest son Jacques, who thought that hand-to-hand combat was unbecoming of a noble, and preferred the romance of King's City. Although Ren repeatedly showed that he wanted to be a knight, but that was in the case that he didn't have the right to inherit the title. Now that the Earl was no longer restraining him, who knew if he would summon his knights and kill the firstborn in one blow? Paying to redeem a person who made him restless, Jacques' decision was very simple and ruthless. My friend will not do that, he said firmly. Maybe, but after you redeem him, whether he intends to do so or not, Jacques will have a headache. Shalafi then said, as for the materials worth 1,000 points, we can choose a craftsman with a higher value. When preparing the ransom for you, I have already transferred some craftsmen. If we fill in more, the craftsmen in the territory will not be enough. Don't worry, do you know that the northern region is in a mess now? The Earl said confidently, the coalition of the four kingdoms was completely destroyed in Hermes, the lords have forced their people to join the army, there has been a large number of refugees. We can take this opportunity to eat a little more, and later even save the monthly materials. Chapter 123. On the fourth day, Roland summoned all the nobles near Stronghold and Stronghold to the castle hall. Although most people already knew the news, he felt it was necessary to emphasize that the western region had a new master. When he stated that he would return to Border Town and hand over Stronghold to the eldest son of the Honeysuckle family, everyone immediately began to talk. Of course, no one was willing to take the lead to express their dissent at this time. The Duke's head was still hanging high at the city gate, and the news of Timothy's defeat made it impossible for speculators to use external forces. Except for the knight of the Honeysuckle family, the other captured knight would not accept the ransom and would be escorted back to Border Town together with the mercenaries. In Roland's plan, all the mercenaries would be sent to mine and reform through labor, and the knight would be employed after examining their repentance. After all, most of the knight were literate and could be used as teachers for universal education. Of course, they would not be allowed to use weapons for the rest of their lives. In this way, the Honeysuckle family would be able to suppress the four families, and the force in their hands would be enough to defend Longsong Stronghold and the Earl's territory, Roland thought. As for the undercurrent surging under the water, it was Perrault's job to worry about. In the past few days, he also took the time to send his guards to arrest a group of officials who caused the residents of Border Town to starve and freeze to death 2 years ago, including Minister of Finance Reynold. They would be tried by the people in Border Town. The only regret was that the culprit who tried to burn the provisions and killed Greyhound, Earl Hilt Med, died directly on the battlefield without a trial. Now, the traffic between Longsong Stronghold and Border Town had been completely restored. In the coming week, there would be more than 10 sailboats every day, carrying a steady stream of supplies to Border Town. Roland guessed that Berev would be very busy. He had to receive the coins plundered from the Duke and settle a large number of immigrants. He did not know whether the temporary wooden shed he had entrusted Carr to build had been completed. Thinking of this, he could not help but want to return to Border Town as soon as possible to preside over the upcoming farming project. After entertaining the nobles for lunch, Roland was about to take a nap when the castle welcomed a special guest. High Priest Tyro of Longsong Stronghold Church. Roland's sleepiness instantly disappeared. Unlike Border Town, the church had taken root here for a long time. Not only had they built a church, but they had also sent a high priest to be stationed here. This was also the main reason why the prince had decided to return to Border Town. Under the influence and indoctrination of the church for a long time, any civilian could become their informant. His plan to have the public participate would be restricted in every way, and the risk of the witches being discovered would also increase exponentially. Unless the church was uprooted, his reforms would be impassable. It was normal for the church to pay close attention to the change of the fortress lord. Roland found it strange that they had waited until today to send a representative to deal with him. However, the identity of the newcomer was not simple either. The followers of the high priest were high-ranking members of the church. They were in charge of supervising a region, and the territory they governed was similar to that of a duke in the secular world. Roland received the high priest in the hall as usual. High Priest Tyler was a middle-aged man in his 40s. He was wearing a white robe with blue edges. His clothes and appearance were neat and tidy, and he behaved like a well-mannered nobleman. If Roland had not been on the side of the witches and the royal family, he would have been happy to talk to such a person. The high priest must have a high-quality god's stone of retaliation with him. To avoid any accidents, Roland specifically told Nightingale to stay away from the high priest before the meeting. After Tyro saluted, Roland invited him to take a seat and ordered the servants to serve tea. No matter what he thought, he still had to put on a good show. "Your Highness, on behalf of the Holy City, I send my blessings," Tyro said with a smile. "You've become the true lord of the Western region. May God bless you." "Thank you," Roland replied in a relaxed tone. "It seems that you don't care about me killing the Duke of Ryan and seizing Longsong Stronghold at all. We rarely interfere in worldly disputes. As long as we can make the people live a better life, we're a wise king. As for which family he was born in or whether he came from the royal family, it's not the focus of the church's attention. In fact, the church doesn't care about one's status. I used to be the son of a farmer, but now I'm the high priest of the church." He smiled. "With all due respect, Your Highness, I'm afraid no farmer's son can become a duke. If he started an uprising to overthrow the royal family, he could become the king himself." Roland thought to himself, but he did not refute. Instead, he changed the topic. "So you're here today just to send blessings?" "Blessings are only part of it. I'm also here to cooperate." "Cooperation? What kind of cooperation?" "In terms of expanding your territory and influence, we can help you to the best of our abilities." "Wait." Roland frowned. "You just said that the church rarely interferes in worldly disputes." "Rarely interferes doesn't mean it doesn't interfere," the high priest said calmly. "Nowadays, the fight between your brother Timothy and Princess Garcia has made the people of the Southern Territory miserable. As I said, as long as the people live a stable and peaceful life, the church will recognize him as a worthy king." "And you are such a person." Roland was stunned. "Does this mean that the other side wants to help me fight for the throne?" He asked subconsciously, "Why? You led the people of Border Town to fight against the demonic beasts and safely survived the months of the demons, which proved your courage and ability. From the large amount of food that Willow Town bought, it can be seen that you don't want the people to starve, which is a sign of kindness. You have 3 noble qualities, and at the same time, you have the royal blood, which is the reason why we chose you." Roland simply didn't believe the reason the other side had said, but at least these words proved that even when Border Town was like an isolated island sealed off by the heavy snow, the church was still watching this remote place. "How can I help?" "Send the Judgment Army to fight for me." We also want to quell the war as soon as possible, but doing so will arouse the resentment of most of the nobles, so we can only help you with materials. The high priest took out 2 pills from his bosom, one red and one black. This is the holy city's prayer room, which is equivalent to the medicine made by your alchemy workshop. The red pill can temporarily give your subordinates great power, while the black pill can increase their tolerance to pain, cold, and heat by several times. With this medicine, your army will be unstoppable. And the church only charges the most basic production fee. He paused. 1 pill of 5 golden dragon. As for these 2 pills, I can give them to you as experimental products to prove that what I said is true. What do you want in return? Expand the scope of the church, and build a church in every territory? Of course, this is good, but quelling the war is our original intention. As long as the people settle down, they will naturally fall into the arms of God. Roland accepted the pills. It sounds amazing, but for the time being, I have no intention of fighting for the crown of Greycastle. Whether it is Timothy or Garcia, they are my blood relatives. I don't want to hurt them. Chapter 124. This is probably the day I've seen you lie the most, Nightingale said as she emerged from the mist after Tyler left. He's the high priest of the church. Roland spread out his hands. How about it? Can you tell if he's lying? No. Everything around him is swallowed up by the god's stone of retaliation. I can only see darkness. It's a pity that I can't treat the high priest like a noble, Roland thought regretfully. He put the 2 pills on the table and asked, do you think this thing is as magical as they say? Morphine could relieve pain. As for giving soldiers great strength, it sounded like the effect of adrenaline. The problem was how to extract these 2 substances and make them into pills. The church should have conquered the world a long time ago. Wait. Roland suddenly thought of a possibility. Could it be related to magic power? Can you see the flow of magic power? He looked at Nightingale and asked, is there magic power in these 2 pills? Nightingale observed carefully and said, I can't see magic power, but it's a bit like the god's stone of retaliation. God's stone of retaliation? Roland was stunned. Yes. She nodded. You've seen the world under the mist. There are only 2 colors, black and white. But that kind of black is different from the darkness formed by the god's stone of retaliation. The latter is more like a hole that swallows the surrounding world. I don't know how to describe that feeling. Nightingale hesitated and said, it's better to say that there's nothing in the hole than darkness. Nothingness? That's right, it's nothingness. She nodded and said, these 2 balls also have traces of nothingness on them, but they're very subtle, and they're not circular holes, but more like flowing black threads. Can this nothingness affect your ability? Nightingale grabbed the pills and released the mist. She quickly retreated and said, it doesn't seem to affect me. It seems that it's necessary to find a death row prisoner to try these 2 pills. Roland carefully wrapped the pills with paper and put them in his arms. I didn't expect the church to think so highly of you, Nightingale said gloomily as she returned to the prince's side. If the high priest wasn't wearing a god's stone of retaliation, I bet 9 out of 10 of his words were lies. Roland pursed his lips. Most importantly, what they're doing and what they're asking for don't match. Why? Look at what they want, more churches, more believers, a prince or a king that they can support, and from then on, they will spread the word that the monarchy is divine. A stable country was better for them to recruit believers and develop their influence. Otherwise, the churches and monasteries would become targets of looting by refugees and nobles. But aren't they interested in the stability you can bring to the people? That's not the case. Roland shook his head. Stability comes from unity or balance. Even if the king eats, drinks, and plays every day, the people of a unified country will live better than the refugees in the flames of war. So it's not strange for them to support the second prince or the third princess, but it's strange for them to support me, especially when Garcia has won a great victory. At this time, if the church fully supported Garcia, King's City and the Eastern Front would be swallowed by her in less than half a year. By then, 70% of the land of the Kingdom of Grey Castle would be in the hands of the Queen of Clearwater. Roland thought that the pressure he would face would increase greatly. Instead of helping the strong, they chose him, who seemed to be the weakest. It seemed that the church's decision was beneficial to him. But if he accepted their support, the situation between the two kings of Grey Castle would become even more chaotic. The direct result of the Three Kingdoms War would be a sharp decline in population, a rapid loss of wealth, and the spread of war to the whole country. The date of unification would be delayed again and again. How would this benefit the church? Not to mention increasing the number of believers, he was afraid that all the churches built in various places would be demolished. I don't understand you nobles thinking, always beating around the bush. Nightingale sighed. Well, Roland replied with a smile, except for me. The witch narrowed her eyes, tilted her head and stared at the prince for a long time. Strange, why is this sentence also true? 3 days later, Roland finally emptied the castle and the Longsong stronghold library. Satisfied, he boarded Little Town and embarked on his journey back home. Along the Redwater River, he approached Border Town. The scene on both sides of the river had changed. On the opposite side of the town, on the open space burned by Anna, many people were busy, looking at their clothes. They should be the serfs who had been transported to Border Town. On the side near the impassable mountain range, many simple wooden sheds had been set up. Some people were faintly moving in the wooden sheds. Roland guessed that these people were the serfs' families. These people had been tied to the land for generations, and their children were also serfs. Because they could not see any hope, most of them lived a numb life. They worked not because of the desire in their hearts, but because of the whips and ropes in the hands of the slave owners. The low production efficiency was simply a great waste of human resources. There was no doubt that slavery was the enemy of industrial production. It was a system that must be abolished. But Roland did not intend to wave his hand and make them all free people. Instead, he wanted to provide a channel for them to see the hope of being promoted to free people, because there were precedents of masters being kind enough to free their slaves from slavery. Even if this compromise was spread out, it wouldn't have too much of an impact. At most, it would make other nobles think that he was just a good person. When the time was ripe in the future, he would fully implement the abolition of slavery, and the resistance would be much smaller. The pier was crowded with sailboats. It was clear that this small pier could no longer bear such heavy transport pressure. Fortunately, Little Town's draft was shallow, so they could directly dock without the pier. It seems that the expansion of the pier also needs to be listed on the agenda, Roland thought. After the group returned to the castle, he didn't have time to rest. When he returned to the office, he immediately called Barav and asked him to report the situation of receiving supplies. The assistant minister was already prepared. He pulled out a roll of parchment from his pocket and spread it out on the big wooden table. Your Royal Highness, the things you brought back to the castle these days really scared me. Although he said so, the overflowing wrinkles on his face betrayed his mood. The 12 apprentices tossed and turned all night, only to count all kinds of coins, a total of more than 14,000 golden dragon coins. Your Royal Highness, this is equivalent to the annual income of an ordinary town. The Duke probably spent more than 20 years to accumulate these golden dragon coins, Roland thought. They came from the plundering, and exploitation of the people of the Western Territory. He wanted to turn them into food, steel, and machines as soon as possible. What about those gems, jewelry, and handicrafts? Chapter 125. What about the people who were sent here? Is there a categorization of them? Roland asked. Yes, please look below. The assistant minister pointed to the bottom of the scroll. At present, a total of 1,100 people have been sent to Border Town. Most of them are serfs and have been placed outside the town according to your request. 35 craftsmen have been assigned to Kar. Their residences are concentrated in the New Civilization District. Barav said the awkward term. But Your Highness, is this okay? I remember you originally prepared it for the witches. The guards I sent to spread the news haven't returned yet. The progress is slower than I thought. The houses will be used by the craftsmen and their families first. We can build them later. In Roland's plan, Border Town would be completely renovated. The wooden houses and mud bungalows would be rebuilt into brick houses. At the same time, spacious streets would be left, unlike now, where most of the alleys were only wide enough for two people to pass side by side. Yes, Barav nodded. Your Highness, I heard that cattle and sheep will also be sent over. Yes, but not now. I deliberately asked them to send them a few days later, together with the herders. West of the city wall, between the impassable forest and the impassable mountain range, there is a grassland. It should be good to change it into a pasture. First, there will be 2 holes in the city wall for people to pass through. After all, it will only be useful during the months of the demons. Now that he had people and money, the bottleneck of the development of Border Town had temporarily disappeared. Roland could finally put his plan into action. He called the guard outside the door and ordered, "Go find Kar of the administrative office. I guess if he is not in the mine, he must be in the wooden shed area outside the town." Half an hour later, Kar walked into the office and bowed, "Your Highness." It had been nearly half a year since the first time Roland met this member of the Mason Association. After being recruited into Border Town's City Hall, he could be regarded as the busiest official in the past 6 months. He presided over the construction of the city wall, the residential area of the model houses and the wooden shed area. At the age of 35, there were a few strands of silver hair on his temples, and his skin had become a little darker. However, his appearance was much better than when they first met, and his voice was full of energy. It was indeed true that the environment could quickly change a person. Half a year ago, he was still a refugee from the Mason Guild who carefully hid himself and changed his appearance. Now, after being a project director and taking charge of the project himself, he already had the demeanor of a leader in his actions. However, what Roland admired the most was his willingness to sacrifice for others. Roland smiled and nodded. "Come sit at the table." He handed over the few sketches he had just drawn. "Take a look. I need you to build something new. This is a warehouse. The bottom is elevated to prevent moisture." Kar quickly scanned through the first sketch. When he flipped to the second sketch, he looked at it for a while. "This is a furnace." "That's right. You'll need to build more than 5 furnaces on the North Slope Mountain. They'll be used for calcining cement and firing clay bricks. Choose a spacious area and consider the location of the material transportation channel and the storage area. In the future, when the scale of the project increases, you'll need to expand more furnaces." "Yes." He flipped to the last sketch and frowned. "This seems to be a ditch." "No, there is a roof and a retaining wall above it. Behind it is like a pool." "Your Highness, I don't quite understand." Roland laughed. "This is a toilet, and it is also your top priority." "A toilet?" Kar thought for a while. "Your Highness, where are you going to build it?" "There are toilets in your castle, and the attendants will be responsible for cleaning them regularly. Most of the villagers don't need this kind of thing, and they can solve it directly outside their houses. The same goes for the serfs. They can just discharge into the Redwater River, and the river will take away the filth." That was why he smelled a strong stench when he reached the shore today. Roland shook his head and dispelled the unpleasant memory. "That's why we need to change this bad habit." Bad habit?" Kar didn't seem to understand. For the civilians who were used to defecating and urinating anywhere, they naturally wouldn't understand how beautiful a world where they could stroll around without stepping on landmines would be. Roland criticized in his heart. "Anyway, You can build it according to the sketch. I've roughly marked the dimensions, and the length I've determined is the same as before. The location will be near the wooden shed area. Build at least 4 of them, 2 by 2 next to each other. Except for the ditch in the middle, which will be built with bricks, the sheds, roofs, and partitions outside will be built with planks, which will save a lot of cement. Your Highness, you want to gather them together. Well, Carr paused. Obviously, he felt that talking about such filthy things in front of His Highness was an insult to the dignity of the royal family. But what if they don't go in? I will issue an order for them to follow. You can go and organize people to carry it out. In that case, I will obey your order. He nodded. Your Highness Roland, I have one more thing to report to you. Go ahead. After the Mason Guild was forced to disband, many people, like me, chose to leave King's City. I want to write a few letters and recruit the members of the Mason Guild, whose whereabouts I know, to come to Border Town. They have their own strengths, such as the furnace you mentioned, which Lozia is very good at. Your Highness, I don't know. No problem at all, Roland immediately decided. Recruit all of them and reorganize the Mason Guild. The pay will be calculated according to the Mason Guild's salary. If they are experienced, it won't hurt to bring them into City Hall. Thank you for your generosity, Carr bowed to show his respect. After the Mason left, he began to write the serf management and disenfranchisement system. Border Town's population was about to reach a peak. If it continued to rely on food imports, once there was a natural disaster or the trade route was cut off, the town would be in a precarious situation. Therefore, in addition to industry, agriculture must also be developed quickly to achieve self-sufficiency in food production as soon as possible. The prince believed that as long as he set up a promotion path, these serfs would soon become active farmers. Coupled with Leaf's improved seeds, the farmland next to the Redwater River would become a sea of golden wheat ears in summer. The requirement to prioritize the construction of toilets was also prepared for the development of agriculture. After having people, land, and seeds, the last thing that needed to be supplemented was fertilizer. Of course, Roland knew that it was very troublesome to use human and animal manure. It needed to be regularly cleaned and manual composted, which was far less convenient than chemical fertilizers. But the chemical industry did not even have a clue, so he had to use this pure natural organic fertilizer. At least human and animal manure had stood the test of time. Until the 20th century, some villages could still see this traditional fertilization method. Chapter 126. The rotation system was not a problem for villages or small towns with low population density, but the land around the big cities was scarce, and this method was tantamount to a waste of land. Places like Silver City, Fallen Dragon Ridge, and King's City had to import a large amount of food from other towns every month. The first step of using human and animal manure was to collect them first. This was the reason why Roland decided to build public toilets as soon as possible. At the same time, it could reduce the spread of diseases and beautify the living environment. It was simply a multi-purpose plan. When the rest of the workers arrived, the construction of the toilets was almost completed. As for how to compost and how to sow, he decided to select a group of experienced farmers to teach them in a few days. After all, the land was still in the stage of leveling and cleaning, and it would take at least a week to start plowing. After finishing the work at hand, he decided to go to the back garden to see Leaf's experimental field. Since Leaf had studied various kinds of seeds and improved them, all the places in the garden that could be used to grow flowers were planted with crops. She also followed Roland's suggestion and divided the flower pond into many areas and numbered them, so that they could compare the development results of the two groups of experimental crops. As soon as Roland stepped into the yard, he was dazzled by the golden wheat. Your Highness, seeing the prince, Leaf, who was squatting by the flower pond, got up, gathered her hair behind her ears, and bowed. Are these the results of your improvement? He waved his hand, indicating that she did not need to be so polite, walked over and excitedly picked up a heavy wheat ear, feeling its plump caryopsis with his fingers. He had no idea what the wheat could grow into, but compared to the memory of the wheat fields in King's City when he was a child, the wheat ear was not only smaller than the one in his hand, but the grains were also a lot shriveled. Leaf nodded and said, "I first let the wheat ear become bigger, ripened, harvested the seeds, and then planted the new seeds in the flower pond to get this kind of wheat ear. But, after repeating this process 2 or 3 times, it is difficult to grow a big and long wheat ear. I don't know why. Unfortunately, I can't help in this regard," Roland thought. According to his poor junior high school biology knowledge, it was probably because of the defect of self-fertilization. Rice was grown in the south, which was a far cry from wheat. In order to increase the yield, the seeds had to be bought. However, being able to last for 2 generations is already of practical value. One wheat plant can produce more than 130 seeds. The first batch of seeds will be transformed by Leaf, and the next batch will be used by the farmers as their own seeds. They can be used for at least 2 years. What about this area? Why is it empty? Roland noticed a flower bed with only a few withered wheat stalks. I planted them there in the beginning. Maybe it's because I've planted them too many times, Leaf said uncertainly. If I cast my magic, the wheat can grow quickly, but if I withdraw my magic, it will wither quickly. It seemed that the magically modified plants still needed nutrients from the soil to continue growing, and some trace elements were still indispensable. Roland walked to the last flower bed. The shape of the wheat here was very strange. There were several clusters of green wheat ears hanging on a stalk as thick as an arm. There were also a few branches growing out of the center of the stalk, and the branches were covered with green leaves. Therefore, the size of each stalk was relatively large, and there were only 2 stalks in the flower bed. This was the magically modified version that Roland asked Leaf to try, the wheat tree. The direction he envisioned was to turn the wheat into a banana tree, which bears fruit from its branches and is harvested regularly every year, thus eliminating the trouble of plowing and sowing. At the same time, it will grow larger and more green leaves, improve photosynthesis, and reduce the demand on the land. At present, the thick stalks and branches took up a little space, and only the branches grew wheat ears, which was not in line with the original idea. Should I ask Leaf to try to improve it in the direction of grapevines? Roland thought, after all, she has never seen a real banana tree, and grapes are not rare in Greycastle. It should be easier to imitate if there is a comparison. The seeds of these 3 stalks can't be used for sowing, Leaf said. I've tried, and the wheat can't germinate after being planted. But it can bear fruit repeatedly. The wheat ears you see are the second batch. The inability to germinate meant that each wheat tree was a unique existence, and Leaf had to personally transform it. At present, its planting value was not great. You've done a good job. The barley varieties will be called golden ones. I'll leave an experimental field on the south bank of the Redwater River for you, surrounded by fences and partitions. You should accelerate the ripening of a batch of golden ones as soon as possible for this year's spring plowing and sowing. Roland ordered. As for the garden, continue to use it to improve new varieties. I've just come up with a lot of ideas. Not only wheat crops, but grapes are also worth a try. Unfortunately, Leaf could only understand the characteristics of a crop from a macro level, such as having many fruits, sweet taste, dense branches, and so on. If she could understand it from a micro level, would she be able to directly manipulate the genes and make subtle and precise adjustments? For example, plants could absorb light other than visible light, such as ultraviolet light, X-ray light, or even ionizing radiation to carry out photosynthesis, directly producing starch, glucose, sucrose, and other energy storage substances. In this way, people could directly plant crops in the culture tank. In the evening, Prince Roland lit a bonfire on the bank of the Redwater River, and ordered Carter and his guards to gather all the serfs. Large pots were carried here by the subjects, set up on the newly built simple clay stoves, and started a fire to cook porridge. The serfs looked at their new master, who had his back to the bonfire, and whose shadow was cast by the fire, and bowed their heads in fear. There were also some bold ones who secretly looked at the prince from time to time. Roland stood in front of the bonfire, and announced the rules he had set to the more than 1,000 people. "I'm Roland Wimbledon, the 4th Prince of Greycastle, the Lord of Border Town, and the Lord of the Western Territory. I've gathered you here to tell you that you're lucky to be able to come to this territory. As long as you work hard, you can get rid of your current identity and status. That's right, I'll give you a chance to get rid of slavery and become free people." The serfs suddenly burst into an uproar. These serfs were very clear about what it meant to be a free person. They would no longer have to suffer the cruel abuse of their masters, no longer have to be forced to carry out endless farming, no longer have to hand over all the crops produced in the fields to their masters, and their sons and daughters could also get rid of the status of serfs. After waiting for a moment, Roland continued to say, "Starting tomorrow, each of you will be given a fixed piece of land, and at the same time someone will teach you how to farm in order to harvest more wheat. In the first year, you can keep 30% of the harvest in the fields, and 70% will be handed over to Border Town. The batch with the best harvest will be promoted to free people. After becoming free people, your family can be exempted from slavery. As for whether you continue to farm or find another way to make a living in the town, it's all up to you. If you choose to farm, 20% of the harvested grain will be handed over as rent, and the remaining 80% will be at your disposal. If you find another way to make a living, the fields will belong to the Lord, and of course, you don't have to hand over any grain." As soon as these words came out, only the sound of breathing could be heard. At this moment, someone suddenly shouted, "Your Highness, is what you said true?" "Of course," Roland said word by word, "as a lord, I never deceive my people." "Your Highness is benevolent," someone couldn't help but whisper, and then the voice quickly became high-pitched, "Long live His Highness." A serf in the front row followed the shout and knelt down, followed by a second person, a third, until there was a dense mass of people kneeling down. The voices rose and fell one after another, more and more, louder and louder. The people's voices finally converged into the same rhythm, "Your Highness is benevolent. Long live His Highness." "Since I got echo, I no longer need to rely on others," the prince thought. Chapter 127. After Roland fell asleep, Nightingale emerged from the fog and gently helped him adjust the quilt, covering his exposed arms. She stood by the bed and silently watched him for a moment, then quietly passed through the floor and returned to her room. "You haven't slept yet?" Seeing Vendi still sitting on the bed reading a book, Nightingale was slightly surprised. "I'm afraid you'll do something wrong." Vendi glared at her. "His Royal Highness is not a child. Is it necessary to watch over him until he falls asleep? His Royal Highness has already sent people to other towns to spread the news that there is a witch organization here. In case a witch hears the news and comes to harm His Royal Highness, what should we do?" "I'm just taking precautions." Nightingale picked up a wet towel and casually wiped her face. Then she untied her red belt, wrist armor, buckles, and finally took off her white clothes. This outfit was His Royal Highness' new work. The pure white hood and coat looked very eye-catching, but he thought it was very suitable for an assassin. Nightingale carefully hung up the clothes, smoothing out every crease. Her curvaceous body was wrapped in a light muslin, her tight abdomen and thighs did not have a trace of excess fat. How could there be an accident? Vendi put down the book in her hand. "There are sisters living in the castle, and there are guards patrolling outside. Besides, didn't you already put the stone under his pillow? You never touched that kind of thing before." "Well, I also want to ensure his safety." She sat on the edge of the bed, took off her boots, raised her slender legs together, and rolled her body to the side of Vendi. "In the end, did you not listen to what I said last time?" Vendi sighed. "Veronica, we are witches." "I know, Vendi," Nightingale nodded, "we are witches. And His Royal Highness will marry a witch, this is what he said himself, and he didn't lie. Of course, Nightingale would not publicize this piece of information unless it was absolutely necessary. She apologized to Vendi in her heart and changed the topic. Do you have any impression of the church? Why are you suddenly asking this? Vendi was startled. When His Highness Roland was in the fortress, the high priest of the church came to visit him and expressed his willingness to support him in seizing the throne. What did he say? Her voice was strained. Or did he ask you to leave before the conversation began? Nightingale shook her head with a smile and softly said, he just told me to pay attention to avoid the range of the demonic stone. Furthermore, His Highness himself did not wear it. Vendi, His Highness did not accept the church's invitation. He rejected them. The latter heaved a sigh of relief, but then seemed a little melancholic. Unfortunately, our help to His Highness is limited, unlike the church, whose influence covers the entire continent. If His Highness Roland agreed with them, I'm afraid he would soon ascend to the throne. Who knows, His Highness said that the high priest was full of nonsense and could not be trusted. Nightingale paused. But there is one thing that I am very concerned about. She told them about the red and black pills. In the fog, the pills and the God's Stone of Retaliation had the same color, which is simply incredible. My sisters have all seen the result of swallowing a God's Stone of Retaliation. It is no different from suicide. The high priest said that it was a drug developed by the Holy Prayer Room in the Holy City. Have you ever heard of this organization when you were in the monastery? When the Witch Cooperation Association left Silver City, Kara had led Nightingale, Windchaser, and Stone to set a trap to catch the villains who had followed them for the bounty. One of the methods they used was to force them to swallow the God's Stone of Retaliation they wore. The villains who swallowed the God's Stone of Retaliation would quickly die, their whole body would curl up like a dried fish that had been exposed to the sun. I don't know. Vendi closed her eyes and slowly said, as long as I can remember, I lived in the monastery of the old holy city. There were high walls on all sides, and I couldn't see anything except the sky. All day long, I could only move around in the courtyard, and it was the nun who taught me how to read and understand pictures. I still remember her name, Farian. One of the books she read to us was dedicated to the old holy city. There were churches, monasteries, libraries, memorial halls, and heroes' walls, but I have never heard of the Holy Prayer Room. I lived in the monastery for more than 10 years, until that accident happened. Nightingale had heard Vendi mention that the monastery had been attacked by witches, and many people had died in that accident. She had also taken advantage of the chaos to escape from the monastery, although I don't know which witch had such courage, daring to challenge the church alone, but at least she saved you. No, Veronica, the witches came from the church. Vendi shook her head. She, like me, is also a member of the monastery. What do you mean? The girls living in the monastery can basically be divided into 3 categories. One is like me, who stayed here since childhood, and don't know where they came from. The other is street children or orphans, who were adopted by churches and sent here, and the last is sold to the church by their parents. The manager separated them according to their age, and placed them in different dormitories, and the content of learning was also different. The youngest learned how to read, the 10 to 14 learned how to sing, and the 14 and above learned etiquette. That's why the nun called us the literacy class, and the older ones were called the choir and the teacher class. Once the girls in the teacher class came of age, they would be sent away from the monastery. This was the first time she heard Vendi talk about these things. She had never heard of her experience in the monastery before. In the first few years, I often heard girls screaming at night. It was all from the choir and the teacher class. I didn't understand what was going on. Until I was promoted to the choir, I found out that there would be adults from the church visiting the dormitory at night, and they would drag a few girls from their beds, and only send them back in the morning. Sometimes, not all of them would be sent back. Nightingale bit her lip. Of course she knew what Vendi meant. This would happen once or twice a month, and when it was frequent, it would happen almost every other day. Then I was chosen, and Farian dragged me out of the room, whispering in my ear that I had to endure it. I was dragged to a half-buried room in the corner of the garden. The room was brightly lit, and there was a woman from the teacher class chained to the wall. There were 4 or 5 people. Her voice trembled slightly. When they approached me, the woman suddenly broke free from the shackles, grabbed the neck of the person closest to her, and killed him like a chicken. She awakened? I don't know. Vendi shook her head. Although those people took off their clothes, they were still wearing God's stones of retaliation. She killed them one by one, and one of them had all his limbs pulled off, and before he died, he seemed to say, "Extraordinary." The adult's scream startled the guards outside the room and Farian. After they opened the iron door and rushed in, they were shocked by the scene in front of them, and the woman directly threw herself at them. "Extraordinary. Do you mean witches?" Nightingale asked. Even the guards were no match for her. Chapter 128. Then she picked up the Judgment Army's sword and stabbed Farian to death. Then she split the other Judgment Army in half, and the blade broke into several pieces. But the whistle alarmed the whole monastery, and many people came here with oil lamps. She took off Farian's clothes and put them on herself. Then she picked up the other man's weapon and walked alone towards the swarm of guards. I sat in the blood-soaked room in a daze for a long time before I came back to my senses. One of the dead people was in charge of the keys to all the entrances and exits of the monastery. I found the keys from the scattered clothes, and at the same time, I also peeled off the God's stone of retaliation from them. At that time, I didn't know the function of the stone, but I thought it might be worth a bit of money because of its crystal-clear appearance. The priests, guards, and Judgment Army were all attracted by her. Almost unhindered, I walked to an unknown small door in the backyard, tried all the keys, and finally opened the small door and left the monastery. Later, I only bought 1 stone, and the rest were taken away. With the 10 silver royals, I wandered all the way to Sewanshire. 2 years later, in the winter, I also awakened as a witch. Vendi paused. This is my whole story. Nightingale held Roland's hand and was silent for a long time before she said, "What about the woman in the teacher's class? Maybe she died, or maybe she escaped." I later inquired about it, and the church said that there was a fire in the monastery, and then they closed it. No one knew, and no one cared where the girls went. They are all abandoned people. Nightingale sighed and held Vendi in her arms. "Now you have us. Go to sleep, Vendi." After a long time, she softly answered, "Okay." The next day, when Roland yawned and stepped into the office, he saw Nightingale sitting at the table, waiting for him with a serious face. "Well, what happened? Have you heard of extraordinaires?" she asked in a low voice. Seeing the prince shake his head, Nightingale repeated the story that Vendi had told her last night. "If it wasn't for her awakening, it's hard for me to imagine that a minor girl could easily kill a fully armed Judgment Army. A witch who is not restricted by the God's stone of retaliation." Roland pondered for a moment after listening to her story, and then remembered the classification of witches' abilities. "Is she a self-strengthening witch?" "Self, what type?" Roland took out a piece of paper from the drawer and handed it to her. "I've made a basic classification based on the way you use your magic power." Self-strengthening witches were constantly consuming magic power to transform themselves, and this transformation was not affected by the God's stone of retaliation. Although the physical qualities of the average witch would also be improved due to the capacity of magic, the enhancement witches were more prominent. If I'm not mistaken, Scroll is also an extraordinary in the eyes of the church. Scroll? Nightingale was startled. But she's not good at fighting, right?" Roland said with a smile. "This classification is not based on the strength of a witch, and it's not necessarily completely correct. It's just my personal opinion and speculation. A strengthening witch can indeed cause a lot of trouble for the church. Without the restriction of the God's Stone of Retaliation, she can selectively intercept and kill a Judgment Army squad, or single-handedly pick up a church in a small town. However, a person's strength is limited, and the number of awakened self-strengthening witches is certainly less than the other two types. Otherwise, the witches would be the ones chasing after the church. Although he said it lightly, but thinking of the red and black pills, there was a faint sense of unease in his heart. No matter how few extraordinaires there were, there should be at least a dozen in the last 100 years, right? As long as there were 2 or 3 strength-strengthening witches, it would be enough to make the church restless. For example, taking advantage of the months of the demons every year, when the church would focus all its energy on the defense line of Hermes, they would wantonly clear the church's facilities in other cities, killing the churches, priests, and priests. If this continued for several years, the church's believers would probably be greatly reduced. However, except for the extraordinary that Vendi had coincidentally met, Roland had never heard of another incident where a witch counterattacked the church. Moreover, even the monastery where Vendi had lived as a child had been covered by a fire, and the whereabouts of the women in the teaching class were also unknown. The church would absolutely not be willing to sit still and wait for death. He thought, perhaps they already had the means to fight against extraordinaires, and these 2 pills were one of them. No matter what, he had to first test the effects of the pills. Thinking of this, Roland called the guard outside the door, telling him to go to the prison to pick up a prisoner, and also to summon Carter. The test site was arranged outside the city walls. In order to be safe, Roland called 4 groups of soldiers from the First Army, surrounding the test site in a circle, armed and vigilant. In addition to him and Nightingale, there was also Anna and Nana standing on the city wall. As long as there was no God's Stone of Retaliation, Anna's green wall of fire was enough to protect his safety. Nana, on the other hand, could provide the fastest treatment. Will there be any problems? Roland leaned down and asked Carter Lannis, who was stretching his muscles and bones, "Do not underestimate your opponent." "Rest assured, Your Highness," Carter put on his helmet, "your chief knight is not an undeserved reputation. Moreover, the opponent is using a wooden sword, there is no possibility for him to hurt me." The test subject was a murder and robbery convict. Roland did not like to play the game of atoning for his crimes. He bluntly told the convict, if he sacrificed himself for the test, his family could receive 5 golden dragon as a reward. After a moment of hesitation, the other party agreed to this condition. Carter originally hoped that the other party would put on armor, pick up an iron sword and have a fair fight with him, but Roland did not hesitate to refuse. If the death convict used a sharp weapon, the danger would increase exponentially. In case the knight's head was cut off, Nana would have no way to save him. As for not wearing armor, it was in itself to test the pain tolerance of the black pills. After the convict took the 2 pills, the expression on his face quickly changed, the blue veins on his forehead and arms bulged, his skin turned deep red, and his breathing became rapid. He grabbed the wooden sword and rushed towards the waiting knight, his speed comparable to a running wolf. The mud under his feet was filled with small holes. Carter looked a little surprised, but he still calmly took a step to the side, raised his sword and slashed horizontally. This move could force the other party to change his direction, otherwise the sword would cut into his ribs. The opponent was just a murderer. In addition to his ruthlessness, he had not gone through any fighting training. Unsurprisingly, he missed his target. A deep cut appeared on the side of his chest, and blood flowed out of it. This kind of injury was enough to affect the movement of half of his body, but he did not seem to care, turned around and rushed towards the knight. Carter used the same trick, but this time there was a slight change. The moment the 2 passed each other, the convict twisted his body and swung the wooden sword towards the knight's position. This kind of awkward posture should not be threatening, but the moment the wooden sword swept out, the knight only saw a phantom. He subconsciously raised his sword to block. The strong impact made him take 2 steps back. The wooden sword also broke. "You have a little strength," Carter swung his hand, "give him a sword, again." The convict did not take the wooden sword thrown by the soldier, but suddenly turned around and rushed towards the direction of the concealing forest. In the blink of an eye, his speed reached a level that ordinary people could not reach. Like a galloping wild horse, his hands crossed in front of his body, and directly hit a soldier who was about to raise his gun to open fire. The latter let out a miserable scream, the body was hit and flew into the air. At this time, the other soldiers had already pulled the trigger. A few spots of blood appeared on the convict's back, but his speed did not decrease. He quickly rushed out of the encirclement. In a few breaths he had already run more than 10 meters. "Don't let him run," Carter shouted, "get my horse." Before the knight could turn over and mount the horse, the convict suddenly shook, looked at his abdomen in disbelief. A diagonal across the abdominal cavity opened up, and hot intestines rolled out. Chapter 129. The wounded soldier was quickly healed by Nana. She was very good at healing broken bones. After Roland ordered the first army to return to the camp, there were only the chief knight, the witches, and a few guards left. With a gloomy face, he walked to the corpse and directed Carter to cut open the wound on his back. The bloody hole was about a finger and a half deep. After cutting open the lead pellet, it was found that the wound was basically no different from that of an ordinary person. "What do you think?" he asked Carter. Carter also looked a little annoyed, probably because he did not expect to be fooled by a person who had never received sword training. "He only has strength and speed. If I didn't want to see how far he could go, I would have cut off his head with the first blow." What if the opponent was a knight? Carter thought for a moment. If it was the Duke's knight, I probably could barely cope with it, but if it was the King's City Knight Regiment's Cold Wind Knight or the Steelheart Knight, I would be unable to resist. Roland did not comment. Carter might be right if everyone fought with skills and swordsmanship, but if equipment was added, the situation would take a turn for the worse. If the prisoner was wearing heavy armor, an iron helmet, and a two-handed sword, he would definitely not be able to win easily. Great power brought about many improvements: the ability to carry heavier armor and weapons, the ability to burst out faster, and the ability to fight longer. Roland felt that he had to correct his previous thoughts in Longsong's stronghold. Adrenaline? No, this thing was much more terrible than adrenaline. Hormones could at most stimulate the human body's potential, but the red pill had obviously made the prisoner break through his own limits. In particular, the speed and momentum he showed when he ran was almost comparable to a heavy cavalry. The effect of the black pill was also amazing. The horizontal slashes and close-range gunshots that almost broke his ribs could not stop him. If it was an ordinary person, he would have long lost the ability to fight because of the pain. A civilian with abnormal strength who was not afraid of pain was already so strong. What about a group of well-trained soldiers? Thinking of what the high priest said, Roland could not help but frown. "Your Highness," Nightingale said, "look at his skin." The skin of the prisoner's hand had become gray after the initial red color faded, and a lot of wrinkles appeared, like a snake shedding its skin. Roland poked it with the hilt of his sword and found that it was no longer solid muscle, but empty. After cutting it open, he found that all the subcutaneous fat had turned into mucus and the muscles had shrunk. This phenomenon is the same as after swallowing the god's stone of retaliation. She looked at the prince. The pill indeed contains stone components. But swallowing the stone alone won't have the effect of increasing strength, Roland thought. How on earth did they make such an unscientific thing? The pill seemed to have strong side effects, and it was unclear whether the side effects were permanent or reversible. Roland was more inclined to the former. If it was the latter, this drug, which was similar to the combination of morphine and epinephrine, could be called a miracle drug of war. As long as it was taken in batches according to the recovery time, it would not be surprising if the Church used it to conquer the world. Even if it only lasted for a short time and had side effects, it was enough to make him vigilant, Roland thought. If the Church turns to support Timothy or Garcia, I may have to face an army of drug addicts. What made him more uneasy was that the church was willing to sell this thing. Didn't they consider that after the unification of Grey Castle, the new king would use the pill to bite them? Grey Castle can recruit more cannon fodder than the new and old holy cities. If they fight, the army of judges will be consumed little by little. Unless, they have a stronger card in their hand and don't care about such a thing. Roland sighed. He had planned to attack Longsong's stronghold to solve the problem of insufficient population and funds, and then focus on education, production and agriculture. He wanted to expand Border Town into a city in a short time. As for the research of weapons, he had to put it aside for the time being. But now it seemed that the construction of the army could not be put aside. The First Army had to expand, the production of flintlocks had to continue, and the research of new weapons had to be put on the agenda as soon as possible, such as the breech-loading gun and the fixed bullet. The mechanical principle of the breech-loading gun was not difficult. The fixed bullet could be made of paper, or it could be made of copper. The only thing Roland had no clue about was the primer for the fixed bullet. He only knew that it was called mercury fulminate. According to the literal meaning, the raw materials must be nitric acid and mercury. As for whether it needed to be mixed with other things, he could not remember at the moment. And in his impression, the production of this thing had high humidity and temperature requirements, so it was relatively dangerous. If he was not careful, his own fingers would explode into the sky. After thinking about it, he decided to spend a lot of money to recruit a group of alchemists. He would build a laboratory in the corner of the town and let them figure it out themselves. After dinner, Roland called Anna and Scroll into his office. Now that Border Town's financial purse was full, he would soon invest half of his assets into compulsory education, which was a big waste of money and a slow return. The industrial society needed quality workers with basic cultural qualities, not illiterates with brute force. If universal education was not in place, the demographic dividend would only become a burden to the population. In view of this, he planned to take some time out every night to come out and give lessons. By the time Scroll mastered the basic knowledge of natural science, the town would almost be able to complete the first batch of literacy tasks. Scroll would be the future education pioneer and all-around teacher, so Roland naturally had to teach her everything he had learned in his life. And asking Anna to come together was out of his preference. Anna did not have the ability to remember everything she saw, but her desire for knowledge and her willingness to learn were the strongest among all the witches. He could often see her rummaging through his bookcase. After half a year, she had probably gone through all the few books he had. In addition, her speed of accepting new things and her logical thinking were also rare in this era. After taking the elementary mathematics and physics textbooks that Scroll had transformed into, he began to talk about today's teaching content. From the beginning of addition, subtraction, multiplication and division to slightly more complex equation calculations, Anna's ability to understand was obviously better than Scroll's. When it came to physics, Scroll would almost always memorize everything Roland said, and then slowly understand it. And Anna could also ask a few questions from time to time. For example, what did the elementary particles look like, why did the elementary particles make up different shapes, and so on. Some of the questions Roland could answer, but some he could not answer himself. For example, what was magic power? He had to talk about the conjecture he had thought about before, saying that magic power might be a kind of energy, similar to electricity and heat, and that currently only witches could use it. He did not rule out the possibility that ordinary people would be able to store and use magic power in some way in the future. Anna showed a thoughtful expression. Time always flies when it comes to teaching women, especially those with outstanding bearing. Unknowingly, the candles had been changed twice, and the new one was about to end. Suddenly, Roland heard a subtle sound. Nightingale was lying on the sofa and had unknowingly fallen asleep. Perhaps such a lesson was like a lullaby to her. The fog was lifted, and her completely ungraceful sleeping posture was exposed in front of the three. Chapter 130. After Anna returned to her room, she threw a cluster of green flames into a large barrel filled with water, and soon the water was steaming. She stripped off her clothes and stepped into the barrel. When the witches wanted to wash their bodies, they would come to Anna to help them boil water. After all, it was very troublesome to bring hot water from the kitchen. When His Highness knew about this, he was quite surprised and seemed to find it difficult to accept the practice of repeatedly using the bathwater. Thinking of this, Anna felt a little funny. It was difficult for the commoners to wash their bodies even once a month, so it was common for them to use the water several times. He didn't even realize how much the life of the witches he accepted had improved. Anna shook her head. His Highness Roland Wimbledon seemed to be knowledgeable, but in some areas he could be called clumsy. From the stories she had read in the books, shouldn't the prince participate in all kinds of banquets and social gatherings from an early age, wandering among the flowers? He could be ignorant, timid, but at least he was good at communication. However, this feeling unexpectedly made her feel at ease. His Highness's head was filled with a lot of amazing knowledge, such as the use of steam-operated iron machines, such as calculating how to make a stone float on the water. And today's lesson, the world was actually made up of countless tiny balls. They were so small that they needed to be magnified thousands of times before they could be seen with the naked eye. Because of this, they were everywhere, whether solid, gas or liquid, whether it was people, flowers or stones. When decomposed, they basically all looked the same. Incredible, Anna thought. How did His Highness know all this? After wiping her body, she dried the water droplets with a fire. She put on her clothes and sat back at the desk. In the center of the table was the textbook written by Roland. Taking advantage of the time when the Book of Illusion was still active, Anna borrowed this textbook from Scroll, wanting to read it for a while before going to bed. The book started with common phenomena in life, like peeling an onion step by step, and some parts were also accompanied with vivid and interesting pictures. The novel knowledge that she had never heard before made her addicted. Anna found it difficult to stop after turning the first page. However, the content at the beginning was still relatively easy to understand, and the latter parts were getting more and more difficult to understand. For example, in the section on temperature, it was written that cold and heat were both manifestations of the ball's activity. The higher the energy obtained, the more active the ball would be, and the hotter it would appear on a macroscopic level. If what His Royal Highness said was right, then when his green flame was enlarged, it would also become a jumping ball. As time passed, the candle gradually burned to the bottom. The flame flickered twice and went out. At this moment, the Book of Illusions had reached its time limit. The pages and the words gradually became transparent, and then disappeared without a trace. Darkness immediately engulfed the room until a green flame bloomed from Anna's fingertip, dispelling the darkness that had entered the room. Looking at the empty table, she felt a little lost. Raising his right hand, the jade-green magical fire stood motionlessly at his fingertips like a cluster of fluorescent light. She suddenly wanted to give it a try. If everything was made of small balls, could it also become as small as a small ball? Anna closed her eyes and imagined its appearance from the accumulation of countless particles. The flames began to change. From the shape of a water droplet, it changed into a thin line, becoming thinner and longer, until it was finally like a hair. Anna felt that this change was far from enough. She thought, for a small ball, a hair is still too big. It can also become thinner. Although she thought so, it seemed that it was difficult for the green flame to change again. The light of the flame became dim, and the slender green light trembled. Maybe it can't be piled up, but connected. His Royal Highness said that there was a fixed chain between the balls. Maybe I should reshape its shape. The flame particles in Anna's mind shook twice, and then dispersed with a bang. They were no longer closely connected, but scattered like stars in the sky. The slender green flame also disappeared, but in her consciousness, the flame still existed, but it no longer had its original appearance. In the deep and boundless darkness, after most of the stars fell, the remaining small part was slowly reassembling. They lined up one by one, and eventually formed a thin line composed of stars. temperature is the degree of activity, she thought. As soon as she thought of this, the line swayed, as if someone had pinched its corner and gently shook it. After this shake, the swaying of the thin line could no longer stop, and a ripple spread out along with it. Her world seemed to be filled with ripples, there was no longer a clear outline between things, and they were jumping with joy along with this ripple. The same was true for magic, she even felt that when she stretched out her finger, the first ripple was the magic itself. She opened her eyes, and everything was calm again. The green flame had disappeared, and when her eyes adapted to the darkness of the room, the desk, the wardrobe, the candlestick, all the furnishings in the room appeared from the shadows. The light blue moonlight shone through the window on the floor, reflecting a small piece of gray. Everything looked the same as usual, there was no change. But in her eyes, the world had become completely different. A black filament appeared in the air. Anna knew that it was not really seen, but from her own perception. She took out an iron ingot from under the table and placed it in front of her. The black filament wrapped around the iron ingot according to her will, and then quickly closed. Like a hot knife cutting butter, the filament was easily inserted into the iron ingot. Under Anna's will, the high temperature produced by this filament was several times higher than the green flame, but it was limited to a very narrow range. The iron ingot quickly broke into two pieces. She picked up one half and saw that the cut was smooth, and when she touched it, she could still feel a slight residual heat. Then she stood up the iron ingot, let the black filament stand at the top, and then split it into a flat filament, perpendicular to each other. This was the mathematical knowledge taught by His Highness in the class. With a point as the center, with a taut line around the center, an accurate circle could be drawn. The area of the circle was equal to the length of the line multiplied by itself, and then multiplied by a fixed constant. Anna controlled the horizontal end of the filament to bend downward at a right angle, and then it went through the iron ingot to the table. Then she let it gently rotate around the center of the black line. Compared to before, where she could only adjust the shape or temperature of the green flame, the black flame composed of particles could not only change into any shape, but the temperature of each part could also be controlled separately. After a rotation, a standard cylinder was cut into shape. You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.